Brand felt the dragon scepter in his hand, felt every line of the carved dragons against his heron-branded palm, as clearly as if he were running his fingers over them. Yet it seemed someone else's hand. If a blade cut it off, he would feel the pain and keep going. It would be another's pain. He floated in the void, surrounded by emptiness beyond knowing, and Saidin filled him, trying to grind him to dust beneath steel-shattering cold and heat where stone would flash to flame, carrying the Dark One's taint on its flow, forcing corruption into his bones, into his soul, he feared sometimes. It did not make him feel so sick to his stomach as it once had. He feared that even more. And larded through that torrent of fire, ice, and filth, life. That was the best word. Saidin tried to destroy him. Saidin filled him to overflowing with vitality. It threatened to bury him, and it enticed him. The war for survival, the struggle to avoid being consumed, magnified the joy of pure life, so sweet even with the foulness. What would it be like clean, beyond imagining? He wanted to draw more, draw all there was. There lay the deadly seduction. One slip and the ability to channel would be seared out of him forever. One slip and his mind was gone, if he was not simply destroyed on the spot, and maybe everything around him too. It was not madness, focusing on the fight for existence. It was like high-walking blindfolded over a pit full of sharpened stakes, basking in so pure a sense of life that thinking of giving it up was like thinking of a world forever in shades of gray. Not madness. His thoughts whirled through his dance with Saidin, slid across the void. Anura, peering at him with that Aes Sedai gaze. What was Berelain playing at? She had never mentioned an Aes Sedai advisor, and those other Aes Sedai in Cairhien. Where had they come from, and why? The rebels outside the city. What had emboldened them to move? What did they intend now? How could he stop them or use them? He was becoming good at using people. Sometimes he made himself sick. Savannah and the Shido. Ruark already had scouts on the way to Kinslayer's dagger, but at best they could only find out where and when. The wise ones who could find out why would not. There were a lot of whys connected to Savannah. Elaine and Avienda. No, he would not think of them. No thoughts of them. None. Perrin and Fail. A fierce woman, Falcon by name and nature. Had she really attached herself to Kolivir just to gather evidence? She would try to protect Perrin if the Dragon Reborn fell. Protect him from the Dragon Reborn, should she decide it necessary. Her loyalties were to Perrin, but she would decide for herself how to meet them. Fail was no woman to do meekly as her husband told her, if such a woman existed. Golden eyes, staring challenge and defiance. Why was Perrin so vehement about the Aes Sedai? He had been a long time with Karuna and her companions on the road to Dumai's Wells. Could Aes Sedai really do with him what everybody feared? Aes Sedai. He shook his head without being aware. Never again. Never. To trust was to be betrayed. Trust was pain. He tried to push that thought away. It came a little too close to raving. Nobody could live without giving trust somewhere. Not just to Aes Sedai. Mat, Perrin. If he could not trust them, Min? Never a thought of not trusting Min. He wished she were with him instead of snugged in her bed. All those days of prisoner, days of worry, more for him than herself if he knew her. Days of being questioned by Galena and ill-treated when her answers failed to please. Unconsciously, he ground his teeth. All of that, and the strain of being healed on top of it, had caught up with her at last. She had stayed by his side until her legs gave way, and he had to carry her to her bedchamber, with her sleepily protesting all the way that he needed her with him. No Min here. No comforting presence to make him laugh, make him forget the Dragon Reborn. Only the war with Saidin, and the whirlwind of his thoughts, and... They must be done away with. You must do it. Don't you remember the last time? That place by the wells was a pittance. Cities burned whole out of the earth were nothing. We destroyed the world. Do you hear me? They have to be killed. Wiped from the face. Not his, that voice shouting inside his skull. Not Randall Thor. Luz Theron Telamon, more than 3,000 years dead. And talking in Randall Thor's head. The power often drew him out of his hiding place in the shadows of Rand's mind. Sometimes Rand wondered how that could be. He was Luz Theron reborn. The Dragon reborn, no denying that. But everybody was someone reborn. 100 someones, 1,000, more. That was how the pattern worked. Everyone died and was reborn again and again as the wheel turned, forever without end. But nobody else talked with who they used to be. Nobody else had voices in their heads, except madmen. What about me? Rand thought. One hand tightened on the dragon scepter, the other on his sword hilt. What about you? How are we different from them? There was only silence. Often enough, Luz Theron did not answer. Maybe it had been better when he never had. Are you real? The voice said at last, wonderingly. That denial of Rand's existence was as usual as refusing to answer. Am I? I spoke to someone. I think I did. Inside a box. A chest. Wheezing laughter, soft. Am I dead or mad or both? No matter. I am surely damned. I am damned, and this is the pit of doom. I am damned. Wild, that laughing now. And this is the pit of... Rand muted the voice to an insect's buzz, something he had learned while cramped into that chest. Alone, in the dark. Just him and the pain and the thirst and the voice of a long-dead madman. The voice had been a comfort sometimes, his only companion, his friend. Something flashed in his mind. Not images, just flickers of color and motion. For some reason, they made him think of Matt and Perrin. The flashes had begun inside the chest, them and 1,000 more hallucinations. In the chest, where Galena and Arian and Katarine and the rest stuffed him every day after he was beaten. He shook his head. No. He was not in the chest anymore. His fingers ached, clenched around scepter and hilt. Only memories remained, and memories had no force. He was not. If we must make this journey before you eat, let us make it. The evening meal is long finished for everyone else. Rand blinked, and Sulin stepped back from his stare. Sulin, who would stand eye to eye with a leopard. He smoothed his face, tried to. It felt a mask, somebody else's face. Are you well? She asked. I was thinking. He made his hands unknot, shrugged inside his coat. A better-fitting coat than the one he had worn from Dumai's Wells, dark blue and plain. Even after a bath, he did not feel clean, not with Saidin in him. Sometimes I think too much. Nearly 20 more maidens clustered at one end of the windowless, dark-paneled room. 8 gilded stand lamps against the walls, mirrored to increase the light, provided illumination. He was glad of that. He did not like dark places anymore. 3 of the Ashaman were there, too. The Aiel women to one side of the chamber, and the Ashaman to the other. Jonan Adley and Altaran, despite his name, stood with his arms folded, working eyebrows like black caterpillars in deep thought. Perhaps 4 years older than Rand, he was intent on earning the silver sword of the dedicated. Eben Hopwill, carried more flesh on his bones and fewer blotches on his face than when Rand had first seen him, though his nose and ears still seemed the biggest part of him. He fingered the sword pin on his collar as if surprised to find it there. Fedwin Moore would have worn the sword as well, had he not been in a green coat suitable for a well-to-do merchant or a minor noble, with a little silver embroidery on cuffs and lapels. Of an age with Eben, but stockier, and with almost no blotches, he did not look happy that his black coat was stuffed into the leather scrip by his feet. They were the ones Luce Theron had been raving about, them and all the rest of the Ashaman. Ashaman, Aes Sedai. Anyone who could channel set him off, often as not. Think too much, Randolph Thor? Enila gripped a short spear in one hand and her buckler and 3 more spears in the other. Yet she sounded as if she were shaking a finger at him. The Ashaman frowned at her. Your trouble is you do not think at all. Some of the other maidens laughed softly, but she was not making a joke. Shorter than any other maiden there, by at least a hand, she had hair as fiery as her temper and an odd view of her relationship to him. Her flaxen-haired friend Somara, who stood head and shoulders taller, nodded agreement. She held the same peculiar view. He ignored the comment, but could not stop a sigh. Somara and Enila were the worst, yet none of the maidens could decide whether he was the Kara Karn, to be obeyed, or the only child of a maiden ever known to the maidens, to be cared for as a brother, bullied as a son for a few. Even Jelani there, not many years from playing with dolls, seemed to think he was her younger brother, while Corona, graying and nearly as leather-faced as Sulin, treated him like an older. At least they only did that around themselves,
Hey,
not
Mamas,
often where
come
other
here.
Aiel could hear. When it counted,
Come here,
he would be
Mamas.
the Kara Karn,
Let's get you up
and he
here.
owed it to them.
Come on.
They died for him. He owed them whatever they wanted.
Oh,
I don't intend to spend all night here while you lot play Kiss the Daisies, he said. Sulin gave him one of those looks. In dresses or in cotton sore, women tossed those looks about like farmers scattering seed. But the Ashaman abandoned staring at the maidens and slung the straps of their scrips over their shoulders. Push them hard, he had told Taim. Make them weapons, and Taim had delivered. A good weapon moved as the man who held it directed. If only he could be sure it would not turn in his hand. He had 3 destinations tonight, but one of those the maidens could not be allowed to know. No one but himself. Which of the other 2 came first, he had decided earlier, yet he hesitated. The journey would be known soon enough, yet there were reasons to keep it secret as he could. When the gateway opened there in the middle of the room, a sweetish smell, familiar to any farmer, drifted through. Horse dung. Wrinkling her nose as she veiled, Sulin led half the maidens through at a trot. After a glance to him, the Ashaman followed, drawing deeply on the true source as they went, as much as they could hold. Because of that, he could feel their strength as they passed him. Without that, it took some effort to tell a man could channel. Longer still, unless he cooperated. None were near as strong as he. Not yet, anyway. There was no saying how strong a man would be until he stopped growing stronger. Fedwin stood highest of the 3, but he had what Taim called a bar. Fedwin did not really believe he could affect anything at a distance with the power. The result was that at 50 paces, his ability began to fade, and at 100, he could not weave even a thread of Saidin. Men gained strength faster than women, it seemed, and a good thing. These 3 were all strong enough to make a gateway of useful size, if just barely in Jonan's case. Every Ashaman was, that he had kept. Kill them before it is too late, before they go mad, Luce Theron whispered. Kill them. Hunt down Samael and Dimandred, and all the Forsaken. I have to kill them all, before it is too late. A moment of struggle as he attempted to wrest the power away from Rand and failed. He seemed to try that more often of late, or to seize Saidin on his own. The second was a bigger danger than the first. Rand doubted that Luce Theron could take the true source away once Rand held it. He was not certain he could take it from Luce Theron either, if the other reached it first. What about me? Rand thought again. It was nearly a snarl, and no less vicious for falling short. Wrapped in the power as he was, anger spiderwebbed across the outside of the void, a fiery lace. I can channel too. Madness awaits for me, but it already has you. You killed yourself, Kinslayer, after you murdered your wife and your children, and the light alone knows how many others. I won't kill where I don't have to. Do you hear me, Kinslayer? Silence answered. He drew a deep, uneven breath. That web of fire flickered, lightning in the distance.
What are you doing, Mama?
He had never spoken to the man. It was the man, not just a voice. A man, entire with memories. Never spoken to him like that before. Perhaps it might drive Luce Theron away for good. Half the man's mad rantings were tears over his dead wife. Did he want to drive Luce Theron away? His only friend in that chest?
Come on, Mama. Come on.
He had promised Sulin to count to 100 before following, but he did it by fives, then stepped more than 150 leagues to Camelin.
There you go.
Night had closed down on the
better?
royal palace of Andor, moon shadows cloaking delicate spires and golden domes, but a gentle breeze did nothing to break the heat. The moon hung above, still almost full, giving some light. Veiled maidens scurried around the wagons lined up behind the largest of the palace stables. The odor of the stable muck the wagons hauled away every day had long since soaked into the wood. The Ashaman had hands to their faces, Eben actually pinching his nose shut. The Karakan counts quickly, Sulin muttered, but she lowered her veil. There would be no surprises here. No one would stay near those wagons who did not have to. Rand let the gateway close as soon as the remaining maidens came through, right behind him. And as it winked out of existence, Luce Theron whispered, "She is gone. Almost gone." There was relief in his voice. The bond of Warder and Aes Sedai had not existed in the Age of Legends. Alana was not really gone, no more than she had been any
What do you
time
say?
since bonding Rand against his will. But her presence had
Come here,
lessened, and it was the
Move.
lessening that made Rand
What do you
truly
say?
aware.
Go.
You could become used to anything, begin taking it for granted. Near to her, he walked around with her emotions nestled in the back of his head, her physical condition as well, if he thought about it. And he knew exactly where she was as well as he knew his own hand's place. But just as with his hand, unless he thought about it, it just was.
She's not
Only
hurting
distance
you,
had any
Big
effect.
Snoopy.
But he could still feel that she was somewhere east of him. He wanted to be aware of her. Should Luce Theron fall silent and all the memories of the chest somehow be wiped from his head, he would still have the bond to remind him, never trust Aes Sedai. Abruptly, he realized that Jonan and Eben still held Saidin too. "Release," he said sharply. That was the command Taim used, and he felt the power vanish from them. Good weapons. So far. "Kill them before it's too late," Luce Theron murmured. Rand released the source deliberately and reluctantly. He always hated letting go of the life, the enhanced senses, of the struggle. Inside, though, he was tense, a jumper ready to leap, ready to seize it once more. He always was, now. "I have to kill them," Luce Theron whispered. Shoving the voice back, Rand sent one of the maidens, Neralia, a square-faced woman, into the palace and began pacing alongside the wagons, thoughts spinning again, faster than before. He should not have come here. He should have sent Fedwin with a letter. Spinning. Elaine, Avienda, Perrin, Fail, Anura, Verlaine, Matt. Light, he should not have come. Elaine and Avienda, Anura and Verlaine, Fail and Perrin and Matt. Flashes of color, quick motion just out of sight. A madman muttering angrily in the distance. Slowly he became aware of the maidens talking among themselves. About the smell, implying that it came from the Ashaman. They wanted to be heard, or they would have been using hand talk. There was moonlight enough for that. Moonlight enough to see the color in Eben's face, too, and how Fedwin's jaw was set. Maybe they were not boys any longer. Not since Dumai's Wells, certainly. But they were still only 15 or 16. Jonan's eyebrows had drawn down so far they seemed to be sitting on his cheeks. At least nobody had seized Saidin again. Yet. He started to step over to the three men, then raised his voice instead. Let them all hear. If I can put up with foolishness from maidens, so can you. If anything, the color in Eben's face deepened. Jonan grunted. All three saluted Rand with fist to chest. Then they turned to one another. Jonan said something in a low voice, glancing at the maidens, and Fedwin and Eben laughed. The first time they saw maidens, they had stumbled between wanting to goggle at these exotic creatures they had only read about and wanting to run before the murderous Aiel of the stories killed them. Nothing much frightened them anymore. They needed to relearn fear. The maidens stared at Rand and began talking with their hands, sometimes laughing softly. Wary of the Ashaman they might be, yet maidens being maidens, Aiel being Aiel, risk only made taunts more fun. Samara murmured aloud about Avienda settling him down, which earned firm nods of approval. Nobody's life was ever this tangled in the stories. As soon as Nerlia returned, saying that she had found Davram Bashir and Bale, the clan chief leading the Aiel here in Camelin, Rand took off his sword belt, and so did Fedwin. Jelani produced a large leather bag for the swords and the dragon scepter, holding it as if the swords were poisonous snakes, or perhaps long dead and rotten. Though in truth, she would not have held it so gingerly in either case. Putting on a hooded cloak that Karana handed him, Rand held his wrists together behind his back, and Sulin bound them with a cord. Tightly, muttering to herself. This is nonsense. Even wetlanders would call it nonsense. He tried not to wince. She was strong, and using every ounce of it. You have run away from us too often, Randolph Thor. You have no care for yourself. She considered him a brother of an age with herself, but irresponsible at times. Bargerized my carries your honor, and you have no care. Fedwin glowered while his own wrists were tied, though the maiden binding him hardly put out much effort. Watching, Jonan and Eben frowned deeply. They disliked this plan as much as Sulin did, and understood it as little.
Really?
The Dragon Reborn did not have to explain himself,
Go in your room.
and the Kara Karn seldom did. No one said anything, though. A weapon did not complain. When Sulin stepped around in front of Rand, she took one look at his face, and her breath caught. They did this to you, she said softly, and reached for her heavy-bladed belt knife. A foot or more of steel, it was almost a short sword, though none but a fool would say that to an Aiel. Pull up the hood, Rand told her roughly. The whole point of this is that no one recognized me before I reached Bale and Bashir. She hesitated, peering into his eyes. I said, pull it up, he growled. Sulin could kill most men with her bare hands, but her fingers were gentle, settling the hood around his face. With a laugh, Jelani snatched the hood down over his eyes. Now you can be sure no one will know you, Randall Thor. You must trust us to guide your feet. Several maidens laughed. Stiffening, he barely stopped short of seizing Saidin. Barely. Luce Theron snarled and gibbered. Rand forced himself to breathe normally. It was not total darkness. He could see moonlight below the edge of the hood. Even so, he stumbled when Sulin and Delilah took his arms and led him forward. I thought you were old enough to walk better than that, Delilah murmured in mock surprise. Sulin's hand moved. It took him a moment to realize she was stroking his arm.
You ready?
All he could see was what lay just before him. Moonlit flagstones in the stable yard, then stone steps, floors of marble by lamplight, sometimes with a long runner of carpet. He strained his eyes at the movement of shadows, felt for the telltale presence of Saidin, or worse, the prickling that announced a woman holding Saidin.
Moving like that, Mama.
Blind like this, he might not know he was under attack until too late. He could hear the whisper of a few servants' feet as they hurried on nighttime chores, but no one challenged 5 maidens, apparently escorting 2 hooded prisoners. With Bale and Bashir living in the palace and policing
okay.
Cayman with their men,
It's
doubtless
okay.
stranger sights had been seen in these corridors. It was like walking a maze. But then he had been in one maze or another since leaving Emmons Field, even when he had thought that he walked a clear path. Would I know a clear path if I saw one, he wondered. Or have I been at this so long I'd think it was a trap? There are no clear paths. Only pitfalls and tripwires and darkness. Lews Theron's snarl sounded sweaty, desperate. The way Rand felt. When Sewell finally led them into a room and shut the door, Rand tossed his head violently to throw back the hood, and stared. Bale and Davram he had expected, but not Davram's wife, Dira, nor Mullane, nor Dorinda. I see you, Karakarn. Bale, the tallest man Rand had ever seen, sat cross-legged on the green and white floor tiles in his cotton sore, an air about him even at ease that said he was ready to move in a heartbeat. The clan chief of the Goshin Aiel was not young, no clan chief was, and there was gray in his dark reddish hair, but anyone who thought him soft with age was in for a sad surprise. May you always find water and shade. I stand with the Karakarn, and my spears stand with me. Water and shade may all be very well, Davram Bashir said, hooking a leg over the gilded arm of his chair. But myself, I would settle for chilled wine. Little taller than Anila, he had his short blue coat undone, and sweat glistened on his dark face. Despite his apparent indolence, he looked even harder than Bale, with his fierce tilted eyes and his eagle's beak of a nose above thick gray-streaked mustaches. I offer congratulations on your escape and your victory. But why do you come disguised as a prisoner? I prefer to know whether he is bringing Aes Sedai down on us, Dira put in. A large woman, gowned in gold-worked green silk. Fail's mother stood as tall as any maiden there, except Samara. Long black hair slashed with white at the temples, her nose only a little less bold than her husband's. Truth, she could give him lessons in looking fierce, and she was very like her daughter in one respect. Her loyalty was to her husband, not Rand. You've taken Aes Sedai prisoner? Are we now to expect the entire White Tower to descend upon our heads? If they do, Mullane said sharply, adjusting her shawl, they will be dealt with as they deserve. Sun-haired, green-eyed, and beautiful, no more than a handful of years older than Rand by her face, she was a wise one and married to Bale. Whatever had caused the wise ones to change their view of Aes Sedai, Mullane, Amis, and Bear had changed the most. What I wish to know, the third woman said, is what you will do about Colaver Saigon. While Dira and Mullane had presence, great presence, Dorinda outshone both, though it was difficult to see how exactly. The roof mistress of Smoke Springs Hold was a solid, motherly woman, much nearer handsome than pretty, with creases at the corners of her blue eyes and as much white in her pale red hair as Bale had gray. Yet of the three women, any eye with a brain behind it would have said she held sway. Mullane says that Bear considers Colaver Saigon of little importance, Dorinda went on. But wise ones can be as blind as any man when it comes to seeing the battle ahead and missing the scorpion underfoot. A smile from Mullane robbed the words of their sting. Mullane's answering smile certainly said she took none. A roof mistress's work is finding those scorpions before anyone is stung. She also was Bale's wife, a fact that still disconcerted Rand, for all it had been her choice and Mullane's. Perhaps partly because it had been theirs. Among Aiel, a man had little say if his wife chose a sister wife. It was not a common arrangement, even among them. Colaver has taken up farming, Rand growled. They blinked at him, wondering whether that was a joke. The Sun Throne is empty again and waiting for Elaine. He considered weaving a ward against listeners, but a ward could be detected by anyone searching, man or woman, and its presence would announce that something interesting was being said. Well, everything said here would be known from the Dragon Wall to the sea soon enough. Fedwin was already rubbing his wrists while Jelani sheathed her knife. No one looked at them twice. All eyes were on Rand. Frowning at Neralia, he waggled his bound hands until Sulin sliced the cords. I didn't realize this was to be a family gathering. Neralia looked a trifle abashed, maybe, but no one else did. After you marry, Davram murmured with a smile, you will learn you must choose very carefully what to keep from your wife. Dira glanced down at him, pursing her lips. Wives are a great comfort, Bale laughed, if a man does not tell them too much. Smiling, Dorinda ran her fingers into his hair and gripped for a moment as though she meant to tug his head off. Bale grunted, but not for Dorinda's fingers alone. Mullane wiped her small belt knife on her heavy skirt and sheathed it. The two women grinned at one another over his head while he rubbed at his shoulder, where a small spot of blood stained his cotton sore. Dira nodded thoughtfully. It seemed she had just gotten an idea. What woman could I hate enough to marry her to the Dragon Reborn? Rand said coldly.
We do.
That caused a silence solid enough to touch. He tried to take rein on his anger. He should have expected this. Mullane was not just a wise one. She was a dreamwalker, as were Amis and Bear. Among other things, they could talk to one another in their dreams, and to others. A useful skill, though they had only used it for him
Let me
once.
fix this, yo.
It was Wise One's business. No wonder at all that Mullane was abreast of everything that had happened. No wonder that she told Dorinda everything. Wise One's business or no, the two women were best friends and sisters rolled into one. Once Mullane let Bale know of the kidnapping, of course he had told Bashir. Expecting Bashir to keep that from his wife was like expecting him to keep it secret that their house was on fire. Inch by inch, he drew the anger, forced it down. Has Elaine arrived? He tried to make his voice casual, and missed. No matter. There were reasons everyone knew for him to be anxious. Andor might not be as unquiet as Kyrian, but Elaine on the throne was the fastest way to settle both lands. Maybe the only way. Not yet, Bashir shrugged. But tales have come north of Aes Sedai with an army somewhere in Murundi, or maybe Altara. That could be young Matt and his band of the Red Hand, with the daughter heir and the sisters who fled the tower when Swan Sanche was deposed. Rand rubbed his wrists where the cords had chafed. All that captive rigmarole had been on the chance Elaine was here already. Elaine and Avienda. So he could come and go without them learning of it till he was gone. Maybe he would have found a way to peek at them. Maybe he was a fool and no maybe about that. Do you mean those sisters to swear oath to you too? Dira's tone was icy as her face.
Okay, Stimpy.
She did not like him.
Okay.
As she saw it, her husband had set off down a road that likely would end with his head on a pike over a gate in Tarvalon,
Snoopy.
and Rand had put his feet on that road. The White Tower will not hold still for your coercing Aes Sedai. Rand made her a small bow, and burn her if she took it for mocking. Dira near Galeen to Bashir never gave him a title. Never even used his name. She could as well have been talking to a footman, and not a very intelligent or trustworthy one. Should they choose to swear, I'll accept their oaths. I doubt many are exactly eager to return to Tarvalon. If they choose otherwise, they can go their own way so long as they don't put themselves against me. The White Tower has put itself against you, Bale said, leaning forward with his fists on his knees. His blue eyes made Dira's voice seem warm. An enemy who comes once will come again, unless they are stopped. My spears will follow wherever the Karakan leads. Mullane nodded, of course. She very likely wanted every last Aes Sedai shielded and kneeling under guard, if not bound hand and foot. But Dorinda nodded as well.
Really?
And Sulin. And Bashir knuckled his mustaches thoughtfully. Rand did not know whether to laugh or weep. Don't you think I've enough on my plate without a war against the White Tower? Elida grabbed my throat and was slapped down. The ground erupting in fire and torn flesh. Ravens and vultures gorging. How many dead? Slapped down. If she has sense enough to stop there, I will too. So long as they did not ask him to trust. The chest. He was shaking his head, half aware of loose there, and suddenly moaning about the dark and the thirst. He could ignore, he had to ignore, but not forget, or trust. Leaving Vale and Bashir arguing over whether Elida did have sense enough to stop, now that she had begun, he moved to a map-covered table against the wall beneath the tapestry of some battle where the white line of Andor stood prominent. Apparently, Vale and Bashir used this room for their planning. A little rooting around found the map he needed. A large roll displaying all of Andor from the Mountains of Mist to the River Aranin. And parts of the lands to the south as well, Yillidan and Altara and Murindi. The women held captive in the Tree Killer's lands are allowed to cause no trouble, so why should any others? Elaine said, apparently in answer to something he had not heard. She sounded angry. We will do what we must, dear to Bashir, Dorinda said calmly. She was seldom anything but. Hold to your courage, and we will arrive where we must go. When you leap from a cliff, Dira replied, it is too late for anything but holding to your courage. I'm hoping there's a hay wain at the bottom to land in. Her husband chuckled as though she was making a joke. She did not sound it. Spreading the map out and weighting the corners with ink jars and sand bottles, Rand measured off distances with his fingers. Matt was not moving very fast if rumor placed him in Altara or Murindi. He took pride in how fast the band could march. Maybe the Aes Sedai were slowing him with servants and wagons. Maybe there were more sisters than he had thought. Rand realized his hands were clenched into fists and made them straighten. He needed Elaine to take the throne here and in Kyrian. That was why he needed her. Just that. Avienda. He did not need her, not at all. And she had made it clear she had no need for him. She was safe away from him. He could keep them both safe by keeping them as far from him as possible. Right, if he could only look at them. He needed Matt, though, with Perrin being stubborn. He was not sure how Matt had suddenly become expert on everything to do with battle, but even Bashir respected Matt's opinions. About war, anyway. They treated him as Datsum, Sulin growled, and some of the other maidens growled wordlessly in echo. We know, Elaine said grimly. They have no honor.
It's okay. What are you doing, Mama? Hmm? It's okay. It was just a speaker, Mamas. Okay. Come here. Oh. It's okay. See? It's okay. It's okay.
Will he truly hold back after what you describe? Dira demanded in disbelieving tones. The map did not extend far enough south to show Ilion, No map on the table showed any part of that country, but Rand's hand drifted down across Murundi, and he could imagine the Dwalan Hills, not far inside Ilian's borders, with a line of hill forts no invading army could afford to ignore. And some 250 miles to the east, across the plains of Moreto, an army such as had not been seen since the nations gathered before Tarvalin in the Aiel War, maybe not since Arthur Hawkwing's day. Tyron, Kyrianen, Aiel, all poised to smash into Ilion. If Perrin would not lead, then Matt must. Only there was not enough time. There was never enough time. "Burn my eyes," Davram muttered. "You never mentioned that, Melaine. Lady Caroline and Lord Toram camped right outside the city, and High Lord Darlin as well. They didn't come together by chance. Not right at this time, they did not. That's a pit of vipers to have on your doorstep, wherever you are." "Let the Algaid Siswai dance," Vale replied. "Dead vipers bite no one." Samael had always been at his best defending. That was Luce Theron's memory,
Okay, buddy.
from the War of the Shadow.
Come here.
With two men inside one skull, maybe it was to be expected that memories would drift between them. Had Luce Theron suddenly found himself recalling herding sheep, or cutting firewood, or feeding the chickens? Rand could hear him faintly, raging to kill, to destroy. Thoughts of the Forsaken almost always drove Luce Theron over the brink. "Dira Tabashir speaks truly," Vale said. "We must stay on the path we have begun until our enemies are destroyed, or we are." "That is not how I meant it," Dira said dryly. "But you are right. We have no choice now, until our enemies are destroyed, or we are." Death, destruction, and madness floated in Rand's head as he studied the map. Samael would be at those forts soon after the army struck. Samael with the strength of a Forsaken and the knowledge of the Age of Legends. Lord Brend, he called himself, one of the Council of Nine, and Lord Brend they called him who refused to admit the Forsaken were Luce. But Rand knew him. With Luce Theron's memory, he knew Samael's face, knew him to the bone. "What does Dylan Tarvin intend with Nean Aron and Elenia Sarand?" Dorinda asked. "I do confess I do not understand this shutting people away." "What she does there is hardly important," Davram said. "It is her meetings with those Aes Sedai that concern me." "Dylan Tarvin is a fool," Melaine muttered. "She believes the rumors about the Karakan kneeling to the Amaran seat. She will not brush her hair unless those Aes Sedai give her permission." "You mistake her," Dira said firmly. "Dylan is strong enough to rule Andor. She proved that at Arengel. Of course she listens to the Aes Sedai. Only a fool ignores Aes Sedai. But to listen is not to obey." The wagons that had been brought from Dumai's Wells would have to be searched again. The fat little man Angriel had to be there somewhere. None of the sisters who escaped could have had a clue what it was. Unless perhaps they had stuck a souvenir of the Dragon Reborn in her pouch. No. It had to be in the wagon somewhere. With that, he was more than a match for any of the Forsaken. Without it, death, destruction, and madness. Suddenly, what he had been hearing rushed forward. "What was that?" he demanded, turning from the ivory-inlaid table. Surprised faces turned toward him. Jonan straightened from where he had been slouching against the doorframe. The maidens, squatting easily on their heels, suddenly appeared alert. They had been talking idly among themselves. Even they were with Perry around him now. Fingering one of her ivory necklaces, Melaine shared a decided look between Vale and Davram, then spoke before anyone else. "There are 9 Aes Sedai at an inn called the Silver Swan, and what Davram Bashir calls the New City." She said the word inn in an odd way, and city as well. She had only known them from books before coming across the Dragon Wall. "He and Bale say we must leave them alone until they do something against you. I think you have learned about waiting for Aes Sedai, Randall Thor." "My fault," she sighed. "If fault be me." Though what Mullane expects to do, I can't say. 8 sisters stopped at the Silver Swan almost a month ago, just after you left. Now and then a few more come or go, but there are never more than 10 at one time. They keep to themselves, cause no trouble, and ask no questions that Bale or I can learn. A few Red Sisters have come into the city as well. Twice. Those at the Silver Swan all have orders, but these never do. I'm sure they are Reds. 2 or 3 appear, ask after men heading for the Black Tower, and after a day or so they leave. Without learning much, I'd say. That Black Tower is as good as a fortress for holding in secrets. None of them has made trouble, and I would rather not trouble them until I know it is necessary. I didn't mean that, Rand said slowly. He sat down in a chair opposite Bashir, gripping the carved arms till his knuckles hurt. Aes Sedai gathering here, Aes Sedai gathering in Kyrian. Happenstance? Lews Therin rumbled like thunder on the horizon about death and betrayal. He would have to warn Taim. Not about the Aes Sedai at the Silver Swan. Taim certainly knew already. Why had he not mentioned it? About staying away from them, keeping the Ashaman away. If Demise Wells was to be an end, there could be no new beginnings here. Too many things seemed to be spinning out of control. The harder he tried to gather them all in, the more there were, and the faster they spun. Sooner or later, everything was going to fall and shatter. The thought dried his throat. Tom Marilyn had taught him to juggle a little, but he had never been very good. Now he had to be very good indeed. He wished he had something to wet his throat. He did not realize he had spoken that last aloud until Jelani straightened from her crouch and strutted across the room to where a tall silver pitcher stood on a small table. Filling a hammered silver goblet, she brought it back to Rand with a smile, her mouth opening as she proffered it. He expected something rude, but a change came over her face. All she said was, "Karakan," then went back to her place with the other maidens, so dignified it seemed she was imitating Dorinda, or maybe Dira. Samara gestured in hand talk, and suddenly every maiden was red-faced and biting her lips to keep from laughing. Every maiden but Jelani, who was just red-faced. The wine punch tasted of plums. Rand could remember fat, sweet plums from the orchard across the river when he was young, climbing the trees to pick them himself. Tilting his head back, he drained the goblet. There were plum trees in the 2 rivers, but no orchards of them, and certainly not across any river. "Keep your bloody memories to yourself," he snarled at Lews Therin. The man in his head laughed at something, giggling quietly to himself. Bashir frowned at the maidens, then glanced at Bale and his wives, all impassive as stone, and shook his head. He got on well with Bale, but Aiel in general mystified him. "Since no one is bringing me any drink," he said, rising, and went to pour his own. He took a long swallow that wet his heavy mustaches. "Now that's cooling. Taim's way of enrolling men seems to sweep up every fellow who'd like to follow the Dragon Reborn. He has delivered a goodly army to me, men who lack whatever it is your Ashaman need. They all talk wide-eyed about walking through holes in the air, but none has been anywhere near the Black Tower. I'm trying out a few thoughts young Matt had." Rand waved that away with the empty goblet. "Tell me about Dylan." Dylan of House Taravin would be next in line for the throne should anything happen to Elaine. But he had told her he was having Elaine brought to Caemlyn. If she thinks she can take the Lion Throne, I can find a farm for her, too. "Take the throne?" Dira said incredulously, and her husband laughed out loud. "I have no understanding of Wetlander ways," Bale said, "but I do not think that is what she has done." "Far from it." Davram carried the pitcher over to pour more punch for Rand. "Some lesser lords and ladies who thought to curry favor proclaimed for her at Arengil. She moves quickly, Lady Dylan. Within 4 days, she had the 2 leaders hanged for treason to the daughter heir Elaine, and ordered another 20 flogged." He chuckled approvingly. His wife sniffed. Likely she would have had the road lined with gibbets all the way from Arngil to Camelin. Then what was that about her ruling Andor? Rand demanded. And imprisoning Elenia and Neon? They are the ones who tried to claim the throne, Dira said, dark eyes sparkling angrily. Bashir nodded. He was much calmer. Only 3 days ago, when word arrived of Kolaver's coronation, and the rumors from Kyrian that you had gone to Tar Valon began to sound more real. With trade beginning again, there are so many pigeons in the air between Kyrian and Camelin you could walk on their backs. Putting the pitcher back, he returned to his chair. Neon proclaimed for the Lion Throne in the morning, Elenia before midday, and by sunset, Dylan, Elavar, and Luan had arrested them both. They announced Dylan as regent the next morning, in Elaine's name, until Elaine returns. Most of the houses of Andor have declared support for Dylan. I think some would like to have her take the throne herself, but Arengil keeps even the most powerful careful of their tongues. Closing one eye, Bashir pointed at Rand. You, they do not mention at all. Whether that is good or bad, it will take a wiser head than mine to say. Dira offered a cool smile, looking down that nose of hers. Those lick-spittles you allowed to make free of the palace have all fled the city, it seems. Fled Andor, some of them, according to rumor. You should know, they were all behind either Elenia or Neon. Rand carefully set his full goblet on the floor beside his chair. He had only let Lur and Aramilla and the rest remain in order to try pushing Dylan and those who supported her into cooperation with him. They would never have left Andor to the likes of Lord Lur. With time and Elaine's return, it might yet work. But everything was whirling faster and faster, whirling away from his fingers. There were a few things he could control, though. Fedwin there is an Ashaman, he said. He can bring messages to me in Kyrian if there's need. That with a glare from Elaine, who returned the blandest sort of look. Dira studied Fedwin as she might a dead rat some overeager dog had dropped on her rug. Davram and Bale were more considering. Fedwin tried to stand straighter under their gaze. Don't let anyone know who he is, Rand went on. No one. That's why he isn't wearing black. I am taking 2 more to Lord Samaradrid and High Lord Wylerman tonight.
Morris Deadwood, how you doing?
They'll have need when they face Samael in the Dwarlan Hills. I will be busy chewing on Kyrian for a while yet, it seems.
Jordan.
And maybe Andor, too. Does this mean you will send the spears forward at last? Bale said. You give the orders tonight? Rand nodded, and Bashir gave a great hoot of laughter. Now that calls for a good wine. Or it would if it wasn't hot enough to make a man's blood thick as porridge. Laughter slid into a grimace.
On the book.
Burn me, but I wish I could be there.
Cause either more
I suppose holding Camelin for the Dragon Reborn is no small thing.
Raid Shadow Legends.
You always want to be where the swords are bared, my husband. Dira sounded quite fond.
No, it's not a Star Wars one. It's
said.
It has to do with the Real Time series by Robert Jordan.
Are you custom allowed
not to be confused with that
place taken by
Amazon Prime show?
Rand had forbidden it.
They mixed it all up.
He would not give Elaine a city looted even that much. They will have the 5th, Rand said.
Yeah, it usually is, just because how late it is.
That he thought. Bring Elaine quickly, Matt. It ran wild in his head, across Luz Theron's cackling. Bring her quickly.
Because it's almost 1:30 for me.
Chapter 8. The Figurehead. We must stop here tomorrow. Egwene shifted carefully on her folding chair. It had a tendency to fold on its own sometimes. Lord Bryn says the army is running short of food. Our camp is certainly short of everything. 2 stubby tallow candles burned on the wooden table in front of her. That folded too, for easy packing, but it was sturdier than the chair. The candles in the tent that served as her study were supplemented by an oil lantern hanging from the center pole up near the peak.
Of your
The
story?
dim yellow light flickered, making faint shadows dance on patched canvas walls that were a far cry from the grandeur of the Amerlin's study in the White Tower.
I don't mind.
But that did not upset her. Truth be known, she herself was some considerable distance short of the grandeur normally associated with the Amerlin seat. She knew very well that the seven-striped stole on her shoulders was the only reason any stranger would believe her Amerlin, if they did not think it an extremely foolish joke. Odd things had happened in the White Tower's history. Swan had told her secret details of some of them, yet surely nothing so odd as her. 4 or 5 days would be better, Shiriam mused, studying the sheaf of papers in her lap. Slightly plump, with high cheekbones and tilted green eyes, in her dark green riding dress she managed to look elegant and commanding, despite her perch on one of the 2 precarious stools in front of the table. Exchange her narrow blue stole of the Keeper of the Chronicles for the Amerlin's, and would think she wore it by right. Sometimes she certainly seemed to believe the striped stole rested on her own shoulders. Or perhaps longer.
Nice.
It would not hurt to build our stores up once more. Swan, atop the other rickety stool, shook her head slightly, but Egwene did not need the hint. One day,
That's nice.
she might be just 18 and well
Morris
short of a
Deadwood.
true Amerlin's grandeur, but she was no fool. Too many of the sisters seized on any excuse for a halt. Too many of the sitters as well. And if they stopped too long, it might be impossible to start them moving again. Shiriam opened her mouth. "One, daughter," Egwene said firmly. Whatever Shiriam thought, the fact was that Shiriam Bayanar was the keeper and Egwene Alvir the Amerlin. If only Shiriam could be brought to realize that. And the Hall of the Tower, they were worse. She wanted to snarl or snap or maybe throw something, but after close to a month and a half, she already had a lifetime's practice in keeping her face and voice
Nobody's
smooth
home.
at far
Nice.
greater
It definitely
provocation
sounds
than this.
interesting.
Any longer and we'll begin to strip the countryside bare. I won't leave people to starve. On the practical side, if we take too much from them, even paid for, they'll give us 100 problems in return. Raid on the herds and flocks, and thieves the store wagons, Swan murmured. Studying her divided gray skirts, not looking at anyone, she seemed to be thinking aloud. Men shooting at our guards at night, maybe setting fire to whatever they can reach. A bad business. Hungry people become desperate in a hurry. Those were the same reasons Lord Bryn had given Egwene in very nearly the same words.
Oh,
The
this plane
fiery-haired woman shot
was
Swan a
played
hard
is
look.
considered a
Many
fantasy.
sisters had a difficult time with Swan. Her face was probably the best known in the camp, young enough to have looked proper above an accepted's dress, or a novice's for that matter. That was a side effect of being stilled, though not many had known it. Swan could hardly walk a step without sisters staring at her, the once Amerlin seat, deposed and cut off from Saidar, then healed and restored to at least some ability when everyone knew that was impossible. Many welcomed her back warmly as a sister once more, for herself and for the miracle that held out hope against what every Aes Sedai feared beyond death. But just as many or more offered lukewarm toleration or condescension or both, blaming her for their present situation. Shiriam was one of those who thought Swan should instruct the new young Amerlin in protocol and the like, which everyone believed she hated, and keep her mouth closed unless she was called upon.
It's more
She was
Lord
less
of the
than she
Rings
had
type
been.
fantasy.
No longer Amerlin, and no longer anywhere near so strong in the power. It was not cruelty as Aes Sedai saw it.
Yeah, it's
The past
fantasy
was
with
past. What was now was, and must be accepted.
magic
Anything else only brought
and
greater
stuff
pain.
like that.
By and large, Aes Sedai admitted change slowly, but once they did, for most it was as if things had always been that way. One day, Mother, as
Having to do
you
with
said,
magic, end of the
Shiriam
world type
sighed
stuff.
at last, bowing her head
Ogres.
slightly. Less in submission, Egwene was sure, than to hide a grimace over her stubbornness. She would accept the grimace if the acquiescence came with it. For the time being, she had to. Swan bowed her head, too, to hide a smile. Any sister might be appointed to any post, but the social pecking order was
which
quite
one,
rigid, and
the Lord of
Swan
the Rings
stood a
type
long way
fantasy, or
further
what's
down
playing?
than she had. That was one reason.
Well, this is
The
book,
papers on Shiriam's lap were duplicated on
what
Swan's
book
and
is
on the
this?
table in front of Egwene. Reports on everything
This
from
is
the
book
number of
7 in the
candles and
series.
sacks of beans remaining in the camp to the state of the horses, and the same for
But
Lord
I've
Bryn's
read
army.
the whole
army's camp
series
encircled
before
the
a
Aes
couple
Sedai,
times. I just
with a ring perhaps 20 steps
enjoy
wide
audiobook
between.
because it's
But in many
relaxing.
ways, they might as well have been a mile apart. Surprisingly, Lord Bryn insisted on that as much as the sisters. The Aes Sedai did not want soldiers wandering among their tents.
There's still more
a lot
combat
of
there,
unwashed,
and
illiterate
it's
ruffians with light fingers often
Robert
as not.
Jordan playing.
And it seemed the soldiers
Or
did
a
not
book
want
by
Aes
Robert
Sedai
Jordan.
wandering among them either. Though, perhaps wisely, they held their reasons close. They marched toward Tar Valon to pull down a usurper to the Amerlin seat and raise Egwene in her place. Yet few men were truly comfortable around Aes Sedai, few enough women either. As keeper, Shiriam would have been all too happy to take these minor matters out of Egwene's hands. She had said as much, explaining how minor they were, how the Amerlin seat should not be burdened with day-to-day trifles. Swan, on the other hand, said a good Amerlin paid attention to just those, not trying to duplicate the work of dozens of sisters and clerks, yet checking on something different every day. That way she had a good idea of what was happening and what needed doing before someone came running to her with a crisis already breaking into shards. A feel for how the wind was blowing, Swan called it. Making sure these reports reached her had required weeks, and Egwene was sure that once she let them pass to Shiriam's control, she would never again learn anything until it was long dealt with. If then. A silence stretched as they
I don't think
began
I've heard
reading
of
the
that
next
person.
paper in each stack. They were not alone. Chesa, seated on cushions to one side of the tent, spoke. "Too little light is bad for the eyes," she murmured almost to herself, holding up one of Egwene's silk stockings that she was darning. "You'll never catch me ruining my eyes over words in this little light." Just short of stout, with a twinkle in her eyes and a smile, Egwene's maid was always trying to slip advice to the Amerlin, as though talking about herself. She could have been in Egwene's service 20 years, instead of less than 2 months, and 3 times as old
So I
as
usually
Egwene
play
instead of barely twice.
by this author, Robert
Tonight,
Jordan,
Egwene
or I'll
suspected
play
that she talked to fill silences.
H.P.
There
Lovecraft.
was a tension in the camp since Loghain had escaped.
I like playing a lot of
A man
H.P.
who could channel,
Lovecraft because a lot of
shielded and
his
under
is
close guard,
public
yet he had
domain.
slipped away like fog. Everyone walked on edge, wondering how, wondering where he was, what he intended to do
I
now.
don't think so.
Egwene wished harder than most that she could be sure she knew where Loghain Ablar was. Giving her papers a firm snap of her wrists, Shiriam frowned at Chesa. She did not understand why Egwene let her maid be present at these meetings, much less let her chatter away freely. It probably never occurred to her that Chesa's presence and her unexpected chatter frequently
But I
unsettled
gotta
her
be
just
careful
enough to help Egwene sidestep
with
advice she did not want
Lovecraft
to take
on
and postpone decisions
books
she did
I
not
play,
want to make. At
because
least not the way Shiriam wanted them made. Certainly
some,
the
I
notion
guess
had
some of the
never occurred to
terminology
Chesa. She smiled
and some of the words
apologetically
she
and
uses
returned to
is,
her darning, occasionally murmuring to herself. "If we continue,
offensive.
Mother," Shiriam said coolly, "we
because
may
a lot of stuff
finish before
the
dawn."
way he said certain stuff
Staring at the
is
next
very
page,
offensive
Egwene
now.
rubbed her temples.
So
Chesa
I
might
gotta
be
be
right
careful
about
which
the light. She had another headache coming on.
books by him I
Then
play.
again, it might be the page, detailing what money was left. The stories she had read never mentioned
I've
how
always
much
been into
coin
horror.
was required to keep an army.
Lovecraft or
Pinned to the sheet
King
were
or
notes from 2 of the sitters, Romonda and Lelaine, suggesting the soldiers be paid less frequently. Paid less, in fact. More than suggesting, really, just as Romonda and Lelaine were more than simply 2 sitters in the hall. Other sitters followed where they led, if not all by any means, while the only sitter Egwene could count on was Delana, and her not far. It was rare that Lelaine and Romonda agreed on anything, and they could hardly have chosen a worse. Some of the soldiers had sworn oaths, yet most were there for their pay, and maybe the hope of loot. "The soldiers are to be paid as before," Egwene muttered, crumpling the 2 notes. She was not going to let her army melt
do
away
you?
any more than she would allow looting.
I'm not
As you
trying to get my
command.
channel in trouble by
Shiriam's eyes sparkled with pleasure.
someone claiming that
The
I'm
difficulties must be clear to her.
putting
Anyone who
hate
thought her less
speech
than
or
very
racist
intelligent
stuff
was in
out
deep
there,
trouble.
so
But she did
I
have
try
a
to
blind spot. If Ramonda or
be
Lalaine
careful on
said
what
the
I
sun was
play.
coming up, Shiriam most likely would claim it was going down. She had had almost as much sway with the
Yeah, I
Hall
see
as
your
they
point
did
in
now,
that.
perhaps more, until they put a halt to it
Then
between
again,
them.
nowadays,
The opposite was true as well.
everyone gets
Those two would speak
offended
against
very
anything
easily
Shiriam wanted
nowadays
before they
than they
stopped to
used
think,
to.
which had its uses, all in all. Egwene's fingers tapped on the tabletop, but she made
I
them
just try to
stop.
keep it
The money had to be found,
neutral.
somewhere, somehow, but she did not have to let Shiriam see her worry. "That new woman will work out," Chesa murmured over her sewing. "Tyrants always carry their noses high, of course, but Selene does know what's required of a lady's maid. Mary and I will settle her down soon enough." Shiriam rolled her eyes irritably. Egwene smiled to herself.
Hell yeah.
Egwene Alvir with 3 maids waiting on her, as unbelievable as the stole itself. But the smile lasted only a heartbeat. Maids had to be paid too. A tiny sum, balanced against 30,000 soldiers.
Hell yeah,
And
Mars.
the Amyrlin could hardly do
That's
her
the
own
way to do
laundry
it.
or mend her own shifts. But she could have managed splendidly with Chesa alone, and would have, had she any choice in it. Less than a week earlier, Ramonda had decided that the Amyrlin needed another servant and found Mary among the refugees who huddled in every village until they were chased away. And not to be outdone, Lalaine produced Selene from the same source. The 2 women were crowded into Chesa's small tent before Egwene knew either existed. The principle of the thing was wrong. 3 maids when there was not enough
Fucking
silver to
fine.
pay the army halfway to Tarvalon. Servants chosen for her without any say. And then there was the fact that she had yet another, if one who received not a copper. Everyone believed Marigan was the Amyrlin's maidservant anyway. Beneath the edge of the table she felt her belt pouch, felt the bracelet inside. She should wear it more. It was a duty. Keeping her hands low, she dug the bracelet out and slipped it around her wrist. A band of silver made so the catch was invisible once closed. Made with the one power, the bracelet snapped shut beneath the table, and she very nearly snatched it off again. Emotion flooded into a corner of her mind, emotion and awareness, a little pocket, as if she were imagining it. Not imagination, though, all too real. Half of an idam, the bracelet created a link between her and the woman who wore the other half, a silver necklace the wearer could not remove herself. They were a circle of 2 without embracing Saidar, Egwene always leading by virtue of the bracelet. Marigan was asleep now, her feet sore from walking all day and days past. But even sleeping, fear oozed through most strongly. Only hate ever came near fear in the stream that flowed through the idam. Egwene's reluctance came from the constant gnawing of the other woman's terror, from having worn the necklace end of the idam once, and from knowing the woman on the far end. She hated sharing any part of her. Only 3 women in the camp knew that Moghedien was a prisoner, hidden in the midst of Aes Sedai. If it came out, Moghedien would be tried, stilled, and executed in short order. If it came out, Egwene might not be far behind her, and Swan and Lyanna as well. They were the other 2 who knew. At best, she would have the stole stripped away. For hiding one of the Forsaken from justice, she thought grimly, I'll be lucky if they just stick me back with the Accepted. Unconsciously, she thumbed the golden great serpent ring on the first finger of her right hand. Then again, however just such a punishment might be, it was unlikely. She'd been taught that the wisest of the sisters was chosen Amyrlin's seat, yet she had learned better. The choosing of an Amyrlin was as hotly contested as electing a mayor in the 2 rivers, and maybe more. No one bothered to stand against her father in Emmons Field, but she had heard about elections in Debbie Ride and Caron Ferry. Swan had only been raised Amyrlin because the 3 before her each had died after just a few years on the Amyrlin seat. The Hall had wanted someone young. Speaking of age to a sister was at least
Oh,
as
what do I
rude as
write?
slapping her face.
Oh, I
Yet she had
don't.
begun to get some idea how long Aes
I'm not,
Sedai lived.
I'm not that talented
Rarely was
enough
anyone
to be
chosen
able to
sitter
write
before she had
anything.
worn the shawl 70 or 80 years at least, and Amerlin's generally longer, often much longer. So when the hall deadlocked between 4 sisters raised Aes Sedai less than 50 years before, and Siain Harriman of the White suggested a woman who had worn the shawl only 10 years, it might have been as much exhaustion as Swan's
I just read
qualifications
a
in
lot, so
administration that
I've
brought the
always
sitters
been,
to stand for her.
I guess, a bookworm
And
since I was
Egwene
a kid.
Alvear, who in many eyes should still have been a novice, a figurehead easily directed, a child who had grown up in the same village with Rand al'Thor. That last definitely had its part in the decision. They would not take back the stole, but she would find the little authority she had managed to accumulate gone. Romanda, Lelaine, and Shiriam might actually come to blows over which would march her about by the scruff of her neck. That looks much like a bracelet I saw Elaine wearing. The papers on Shiriam's lap crackled as she leaned forward for a better look. And Nynaeve. They shared it, as I recall. Egwene gave a start. She'd been careless. It's the same. A
That
remembrance
makes stuff out of
gift when they
paracord.
left. Twisting the
saw,
silver circlet around her wrist,
patches
she
on
felt a
stuff.
stab of guilt that was all her own. The bracelet appeared segmented, but so cunningly you could not see how exactly. She had hardly thought of Nynaeve and Elaine since their departure for Ebu Dar. Perhaps she should call them back. Their search was not going well, it seemed, though they denied it. Still, if they could find what they were after... Shiriam was frowning. Whether or not at the bracelet, Egwene could not say. She could not allow Shiriam to start thinking too much on that bracelet, though. If she ever noticed that the necklace Marigan wore was a match, there might be painfully awkward questions. Rising,
when I make out a
Egwene smoothed her
paracord,
skirt
yeah.
as she moved around the table. Swan had acquired several
I'll
pieces
make,
of
like,
information today.
vests
One
with all
could be
kinds of
put to good
patches on
use
it, and
now.
I'll
She was not the
sell
only one with
those too.
secrets. Shiriam looked surprised when she stopped too close
I'll make
for
stuff
the
out
other
of
woman to
paracord.
stand. Daughter, I've learned that a few
leashes,
days after
dog
Swan and
collars,
Lyanna arrived in Salidar, 10 sisters
self-defense
left.
weapons.
2 from each Aja there, except the blue. Where did they go, and why? Shiriam's eyes narrowed a fraction, but she wore serenity as
It's a picture
comfortably
I
as her breast.
found
Mother, I can
that I
hardly
just
recall
added
every... No
a couple
dancing
things
around,
to,
Shiriam. Egwene
it's a
moved a
thumbnail
little
that fits
closer,
what I do
until
here
their knees
on my
almost
nighttime
touched.
streams.
No lies by
It's
omission.
a book and
truth.
chilling and smoking.
A frown creased Shiriam's smooth
But I
forehead.
definitely appreciate
Mother,
it.
even if I knew, you cannot trouble yourself with every little... The truth, Shiriam. The whole truth. Must I ask before the entire hall why I cannot have the truth from my keeper? I will have it, daughter, one way or another. I will have it. Shiriam's
Drawing,
head swiveled as though
I
she were
have,
looking for a
but-
way to escape. Her eyes fell on Chesa, hunched over her sewing, and she all
fucking
but
fly.
gasped
Almost
with
had him.
relief. Mother, tomorrow, when we are alone, I am sure I can explain everything to your satisfaction. I must speak with a few of the sisters first, so they could work up what Shiriam was to tell her tomorrow. Chesa, Egwene said, wait outside, please.
Yeah, but
For
I've
all
tried
that she
drawing,
seemed
but yeah, I'm not
focused on
very
her
good
work
at it.
to the exclusion of everything else, Chesa bounded to her feet in a flash and very nearly ran from the tent. When Aes Sedai were at odds, anyone with half a brain went elsewhere. Now, daughter, Egwene said, the truth, all that you know. This is as private as you will be, she added when Shiriam glanced at Swan. For a moment, Shiriam adjusted her skirts, plucking at them really, avoiding Egwene's eyes, no doubt still working out evasions. But the 3 oaths tracked her. She could not speak an untrue word, and whatever she thought of Egwene's true position, slipping behind her back was a long way from denying her authority to her face. Even Romanda maintained the proper courtesies,
You're
if
hoping
only
I
by
was
a
what?
hair at times. Drawing a deep breath, Shiriam folded her hands in her lap and spoke to Egwene's chest, matter of fact. When we learned the Red Aja was responsible for setting Loghain up as a
I
false
don't know, I
dragon,
have to
we
read the
felt
whole
something
story
had
to
be done.
make a determination.
We certainly meant the small coterie of sisters she had gathered around her. Carlinia and Bayonin and the rest held as much real sway as most sitters, if not actually in the hall. Elida was sending out demands for every sister to return to the tower, so we chose 10 sisters to do just that, by the fastest means they could manage. They all should be there long since, quietly making sure that every sister in the tower understands the truth of what the Reds did with Loghain. Not... She hesitated, then finished in a rush. Not even the hall knows of them. Egwene stepped away, rubbing her temples again.
But from that
quietly
little bit
making
you put
sure,
out, it sounds
in the
pretty
hope that Elida would
interesting.
be diffused. Not exactly a bad scheme, really. It might even work eventually. It might take years, too. But then for most sisters, the longer they could go without truly doing anything, the better. With enough time, they could convince the world that the White Tower had never really broken. It had been broken before, even if only a handful knew it. Maybe with enough time, they could find a way to adjust everything so it had not, really. Why keep it from the hall, Shiriam? Surely you don't think any of them would betray your plan to
No
Elida?
shit.
Half the sisters eyed the other half askance for fear of Elida's sympathizers, partly for fear of that. Mother, a sister who decided that what we do is a mistake would hardly let herself be chosen a sitter. Any such would have taken herself away long since. Shiriam had not relaxed, but her voice took on the patient, instructing tone she seemed to think had the greatest effect on Egwene. Usually, though, she was more adroit at changing the subject. These suspicions are the worst problem we face for the time being. No one really trusts anyone. If we could only see how to... The Black Aja. Swan cut in quietly. That's what chills your blood like a silver pike up your skirts. Who can say for sure who is black? And who can say what a black sister might do? Shiriam darted another hard look at Swan. After a moment, the force went out of her. Or rather, one sort of tension replaced another. She glanced at Egwene, then nodded reluctantly. By the sour twist to her mouth, she would have made another evasion had it not been plain Egwene would not stand for it. Most sisters in the camp believed now, but after more than 3,000 years denying the Black Aja's existence, it was a queasy belief. Almost no one would open her mouth on that topic, no matter what they believed. The question, Mother, Swan went on, is what happens when the hall does find out. She seemed to be thinking aloud again. I can't see any sitter accepting the excuse that she couldn't be told because she might be on Elida's side. And as for the possibility she might be Black Aja, yes, I think they will be quite upset. Shiriam's face paled slightly. It was a wonder she did not go dead white. Upset did not begin to cover it. Yes, Shiriam would face much more than upset if this came out. Now was the time to drive home her advantage, but another question occurred to Egwene. If Shiriam and her friends had sent... what were they? Not spies. Ferrets, maybe, sent into the walls after rats. If Shiriam had sent ferrets into the White Tower, could... A sudden stab of pain through that pocket of sensations in the back of her head sent everything else flying. Had she felt it directly, it would have been numbing. As it was, her eyes bulged in shock. A man who could channel was touching the necklace around Mogedian's neck. This was one link no man could be brought into. Pain, and something unheard of from Mogedian. Hope. And then it was all gone. The awareness, the emotions. The necklace was off. I need some fresh air, she managed. Shiriam started to rise, and Swan, but she waved them back down. No, I want to be alone, she said hastily. Swan, find out everything Shiriam knows about the ferrets. Light, I meant the 10 sisters. They both stared at her, but thank the light neither followed as she snatched the lantern from its hook and hurried out. It would not do for the Armerlin to be seen running, yet she came close, hoisting her divided skirts as well as she could with her free hand, and very nearly trotting. A cloudless sky made the moonlight bright, dappling the tents and wagons with shadows. Most people in the camp were asleep, but low fires still burned here and there. A handful of warders were about, a few servants, too many eyes to see if she ran. The last thing she wanted was someone offering help. She realized she was panting, but from alarm, not exertion. Thrusting her head and the lantern into Marigan's tiny tent, she found it empty. The blankets that made up the pallet on the ground lay in a sprawl, tossed aside by someone in a hurry. And what if she had still been here, she wondered, with the necklace off, and maybe whoever freed her. Shivering, she withdrew slowly. Moghedien had good reason to dislike her very personally, and the only sister who could match one of the Forsaken alone when she could channel at all was in Ebu Dar. Moghedien could have killed Egwene without anyone noticing. Even had a sister felt her channel, there would be nothing remarkable in that. Worse, Moghedien might not have killed her, and no one would have known anything until they found the pair of them gone. "Mother," Chesa fussed behind her, "you should not be out in the night air. Night air is bad air. If you wanted Marigan, I could have fetched her." Egwene very nearly jumped. She had not been aware of Chesa following her. She studied the people at the nearest fires. They had gathered for companionship, not warmth in this unholy heat, and they were not close, but maybe someone had seen who went into Marigan's tent. She certainly had few visitors, and no men among them. A man might well have been remarked. "I think she has run away, Chesa." "Why, that wicked woman!" Chesa exclaimed. "I always said she had a mean air and a sneaking eye. Slinking away like a thief after you took her in. She'd be starving by a road if not for you. No gratitude at all." She followed all the way back to the tent where Egwene slept, nattering on about wickedness in general, the thanklessness of Marigan in particular, and how that sort should be handled, which seemed to jump between switching them till they settled down and tossing them out before they could run away. Tucked around cautions that Egwene check her jewelry to be sure it was all still there. Egwene barely heard. Her mind spun. It could not have been Logain, could it? He could not have known about Moghedien, much less come back to rescue her. Could he? Those men Rand was gathering, those Ashaman. Rumor in every village carried whispers of Ashaman and the Black Tower. Most of the sisters tried to pretend they were unaffected by dozens of men who could channel gathering in one spot. The worst of the tales had to be inflated. Rumor always exaggerated. But Egwene's toes wanted to curl under with fright whenever she thought of them. An Ashaman could have. But why? How would he have known any more than Logain? She was trying to avoid the only reasonable conclusion. Something far worse than Logain had come back, or even Ashaman. One of the Forsaken had freed Moghedien. Ravine was dead by Rand's hand, according to Nynaeve, and he had killed Ishamael as well, or so it seemed. And Aginor and Balthamel. Moiraine had killed Balal. That left only Asmodean, Demondred, and Samael among the men. Samael was in Ilion. No one knew where the others were, or any of the women who survived. Moiraine had done for Lanfear, too, or they had done for each other, but all the other women were still alive, so far as anyone knew. Forget the women. It had been a man. Which? Plans had been laid long since in case one of the Forsaken struck at the camp. No one sister here could equal any of the Forsaken by herself, but linked in circles was another matter, and any Forsaken who stepped into their camp would find circles forming on every side of him. Or her, once they realized who she was. The Forsaken showed no signs of agelessness for some reason. Maybe it was some effect of being connected to the Dark One. This was dithering. She had to start thinking clearly. "Chesa? Look like you need your head rubbed for the ache again, is what you... Yes, Mother?
Ugh.
Find Swan and Lyanna. Tell them to come to me, but don't let anyone hear you." Grinning, Chesa dropped a curtsy and scampered out. She could hardly avoid knowing the currents that swirled around Egwene, yet she found all the plotting and scheming fun. Not that she knew more than surface, and little enough of that. Egwene did not doubt her loyalty, but Chase's opinion of what was exciting might change if she learned the depth of those swirls. Channeling the oil lamps inside the tent alight, Egwene blew out the lantern and set it carefully in a corner. Maybe she had to think clearly, but she still felt as if she was stumbling in the dark. Chapter 9. A Pair of Silverpike. Egwene was sitting in her chair, one of the few real chairs in the camp, with a little plain carving like a farmer's best armchair, roomy and comfortable enough that she felt only a touch of guilt about taking up valuable wagon space for it. She was sitting there trying to pull her thoughts together when Swan swept aside the entry flaps and ducked into the tent. Swan was not happy. "Why in the light did you run off?" Her voice had not changed with her face, and she chided with the best even when she did it in respectful tones, barely respectful. Her blue eyes remained the same, too. They could have done for a saddle-maker's awls. "Shiriam brushed me aside like a fly." That surprisingly delicate mouth twisted bitterly. "She was gone almost as soon as you were. Don't you realize she handed herself to you? She certainly does. Her and Anaya and Morvrin and the lot of them. You can be sure they'll spend tonight trying to bail water and patch holes. They could manage it. I don't see how, but they might." Almost as the last word left her mouth, Lyanna entered. A tall, willowy woman, her coppery face was as youthful as Swan's, and for the same reason. She also was more than old enough to be Egwene's mother, in truth. Lyanna took one look at Swan and threw up her hands as much as the roof of the tent would allow. "Mother, this is a foolish risk." Her dark eyes went from dreamy to flashing, but her voice had a languorous quality even when she was irritated. Once it had been brisk. "If anyone sees Swan and me together this way—" "I don't care if the whole camp learns your squabbling is a fraud," Egwene broke in sharply, weaving a small barrier against eavesdropping around the three of them. It could be worked through with time, but not without detection, so long as she held the weave instead of tying it off. She did care, and perhaps she should not have called them both, but her first half-coherent thought had been to summon the two sisters she could count on. No one in the camp so much as suspected. Everyone knew the former Amerlin and her former keeper detested one another every bit as much as Swan detested being tutor to her successor. Should any sister uncover the truth, they might well find themselves doing penance for a long time to come, and not an easy one. Aes Sedai appreciated being made fools of even less than other people. Kings had been made to pay for that. But in the meanwhile, their supposed animosity resulted in a certain leverage with the other sisters, including sitters. If they both said the same thing, it must be so. Another incidental effect of being stilled was very useful, one no one else knew about. The three oaths no longer held them. They could lie like wool merchants now. Schemes and deceptions on every side. The camp was like some fetid swamp where strange growths sprouted unseen in mists. Maybe anywhere Aes Sedai gathered was like that. After 3,000 years of plotting, however necessary, it was hardly surprising that scheming had become second nature to most sisters, and only a breath away for the rest. The truly horrible thing was that she found herself beginning to enjoy all the machinations. Not for their own sake, but as puzzles, though no twisted bits of iron could intrigue her a quarter so much. What that said about her she did not want to know. Well, she was Aes Sedai, whatever anyone thought, and she had to take the bad of it with the good. "Moghedien has escaped," she went on without pause. "A man removed the Idam from her, a man who can channel. I think one of them took the necklace away. It wasn't in her tent, that I saw. There might be some way to find it using the bracelet, but if there is, I don't know it." That took the starch right out of them. Lyanna's legs gave way, and she dropped like a sack onto the stool Chesa sometimes used. Swan sat down on the cot slowly, back very straight, hands very still on her knees. Incongruously, Egwene noticed that her dress had tiny blue flowers embroidered in a wide Tyran maze around the bottom, a band that made the divided skirts seem one when she was still. Another band curved becomingly across the bodice. Concern for her clothes, that they be pretty instead of just suitable, was certainly a small point looking at it one way. She never considered it seems. Yet in another it was as drastic as her face, and a puzzle. Swan resented the changes and resisted them, except for this one. Lyanna, on the other hand, in true Aes Sedai fashion, embraced what had changed. A young woman again. Egwene had overheard a yellow exclaiming in wonder that both were prime childbearing age by everything she could find. She might never have been keeper, never have had any other face. The very image of practicality and efficiency became the ideal of an indolent and alluring Domani woman. Even her riding dress was cut in the style of her native land, and no matter that its silk, so thin it barely seemed opaque, was as impractical as the pale green color for traveling dusty roads. Told that having been stilled had broken all ties and associations, Liana had chosen the green Aja over a return to the blue. Changing Ajas was not done, but then no one had been stilled and then healed before either. Swan had gone right back into the blue, grumbling over the idiotic need to entreat and appeal for acceptance, as the formal phrase went. "Oh, light," Liana breathed, as she thumped onto the stool with considerably less than her usual grace. "We should have turned her over for trial the first day. Nothing we've learned from her is worth letting her loose on the world again. Nothing." It was a measure of her shock. She did not normally go about stating the obvious. Her brain had not grown indolent, whatever her outward demeanor. Languid and seductive Domani women might be on the outside, but they were still known as the sharpest traders anywhere. "Blood and bloody... We should have had her watched," Swan growled through her teeth. Egwene's eyebrows rose. Swan must be as shaken as Liana. "By who, Swan? Pheolane? Theodrin? They don't even know you two are of my party." A party? 5 women. And Pheolane and Theodrin were hardly eager adherents, especially Pheolane. Nynaeve and Elaine could be counted too, of course, and Birgitta certainly, even if she was not Aes Sedai, but they were a long way off. Stealth and cunning were still her major strengths, plus the fact that no one expected them of her. How should I have explained to anyone why they were supposed to watch my serving woman? For that matter, what good would it have done? It had to be one of the Forsaken. Do you really think Pheolane and Theodrin together could have stopped him? I'm not sure I could have, even linked with Romanda and Lelaine. They were the next 2 strongest women in the camp, as strong in the power as Swan used to be. Swan visibly forced a scowl from her face, but even so, she snorted. She often said that if she could no longer be Amyrlin, then she would teach Egwene how to be the best Amyrlin ever, yet the transition from lion on a hill to mouse underfoot was difficult. Egwene allowed her no little latitude because of that. "I want the 2 of you to ask about among those near the tent Moghedien was sleeping in. Someone must have seen the man. He had to come afoot. Anybody opening a gateway inside a space that little risked cutting her in 2, however small he wove it." Swan snorted, louder than the first time. "Why bother?" she growled. "Do you mean to go chasing after like some fool hero in a Glee Man's fool story and bring her back? Maybe tie up all the Forsaken at one go? Win the last battle while you're at it? Even if we get a description head to toe, nobody knows one Forsaken from another. Nobody here, anyway. It's the most bloody useless barrel of fish guts I ever... Swan," Egwene said sharply, sitting up straighter. Latitude was one thing, but there were limits. She did not put up with this even from Romanda. Color bloomed slowly in Swan's cheeks. Struggling to master herself, she kneaded her skirts and avoided Egwene's eyes. "Forgive me, Mother," she said finally. She almost sounded as if she meant it. "It's been a difficult day for her, Mother," Liana put in with an impish smile. She was very good at those, though she generally used them to set some man's heart racing. Not promiscuously, of course. She possessed discrimination and discretion in ample supply. But then most are. If she could only learn not to throw things at Gareth Bryn every time she gets angry. "Enough!" Egwene snapped. Liana was only trying to take a little of the pressure from Swan, but she was in no mood for it. "I want to know anything I can learn about whoever freed Moghedien, even if it's just whether he was short or tall. Any scrap that makes him less a shadow creeping in the dark, if that's not more than I have a right to ask." Liana sat quite still, staring at the flowers in the carpet in front of her toes. The redness spread to cover nearly Swan's whole face. With her fair skin, it made her look like a sunset. "I humbly beg your pardon, Mother." This time she did sound penitent. Her difficulty meeting Egwene's gaze was obvious. Sometimes it's hard. Nope, no excuses. I humbly beg pardon. Egwene fingered her stole, letting the moment set itself as she looked at Swan without blinking. That was something Swan herself had taught her, but after a bit she shifted uneasily on the cot. When you knew you were in the wrong, silence pricked, and the pricks drove home that you were wrong. Silence was a very useful tool in a number of situations. Since I can't recall what I should forgive, she said at last, quietly, there seems to be no need. But Swan, don't let it happen again. Thank you, Mother. A hint of wry laughter curled the corners of Swan's mouth. If I may say so, I seem to have taught you very well. But if I may suggest? She waited for Egwene's impatient nod. One of us should carry your order to Phelan or Theodrin to ask the questions, very sulky at being made a messenger. They'll occasion a deal less comment than Lyanna or I. Everyone knows you are their patron. Egwene agreed immediately. She still was not thinking clearly, or she would have seen that for herself. The headachy feeling was back again. Chesa claimed it came from too little sleep, but sleeping was difficult when your head felt taut as a drumhead. It would take a larger head than hers not to feel tight, stuffed with as many worries as she had. Well, at least now she could pass on the secrets that had kept Moghedien hidden, how to weave disguises with the power and how to mask your ability from other women who could channel. Revealing those had been too risky when they might have led to unmasking Moghedien. A bit more acclaim, she thought wryly. There had been great weeping and exclaiming when she announced the once lost secret of traveling, which was her own, and more praise since for every one of the secrets she had wrenched out of Moghedien, like pulling a back tooth each time. None of the acclaim made an ounce of difference in her position, though. You could pat a talented child on the head without forgetting she was a child. Lyanna departed with a curtsy and a dry comment that she was not sorry somebody else would have less than a full night's rest for once. Swan waited. No one could be allowed to see her and Lyanna leaving together. For a time, Egwene merely studied the other woman. Neither spoke. Swan seemed lost in thought. Finally, she gave a start and stood, straightening her dress, plainly preparing to go. Swan, Egwene began slowly, and found herself uncertain how to continue. Swan thought she understood. You were not only right, Mother, she said, looking Egwene straight in the eye. You were lenient. Too lenient, though I say it who shouldn't. You are the Amerlin seat, and no one may be insolent or impertinent to you. If you'd given me a penance that made even Ramonda feel sorry for me, it would have been no more than I deserved. I will remember that next time, Egwene said, and Swan bowed her head as if in acceptance. Maybe it was. Unless the changes in her ran deeper than seemed possible, there almost certainly would be a next time, and more after that. But what I want to ask about is Lord Bryn. All expression vanished from Swan's face. Are you sure you wouldn't like me to intervene? Why would I want that, Mother? Swan's voice was blander than cold water soup. The only duties I have are teaching you the etiquette of your office and handing Shiriam reports from my eyes and ears. She still retained some of her former network, though it was doubtful any knew who their reports went to now. Gareth Bryn hardly requires enough of my time to interfere with that. She almost always referred to him that way, and even when she used his title, she put a bite into it. Swan, a burned barn and a few cows couldn't cost that much. Not compared with paying and feeding all those soldiers, certainly. But she had offered before, and the stiff reply was the same. I thank you, Mother, but no. I won't have him saying I break my word and I swore to work the debt off. Abruptly, Swan's stiffness dissolved in laughter. Rare when she spoke about Lord Bryn. Scowls were much more common. If you need to worry about somebody, worry about him, not me. I need no help handling Gareth Bryn. And that was the strange part. Weak she might be in the One Power now, but not so weak that Swan had to keep on as his servant, spending hours up to her elbows in hot soapy water with his shirts and small clothes. Perhaps she did so in order to have someone at hand on whom she could loose the temper she was otherwise forced to keep in a sack. Whatever the reason, it occasioned no little talk, and confirmed her oddness in many eyes. She was Aes Sedai, after all, if rather far down. His methods of dealing with her temper, once she threw plates and boots anyway, outraged her and provoked threats of dire consequences. Yet though she could have wrapped him up unable to stir a finger over his knee. That fact she had kept hidden from most so far, but some things slipped out when she was in a rage, or when Lyanna was in a humor. There seemed to be no explanation. Swan was not weak-spirited or a fool. She was neither meek nor afraid. She was not... You might as well be on your way, Swan. Clearly, some secrets were not going to be revealed tonight. It's late, and I know you want your bed. Yes, Mother. And thank you, she added, though Egwene could not have said for what. After Swan left,
Hey,
Egwene
Scott, how
rubbed
you
her
doing?
temples once more. She wanted to pace. The tent would not do it. It might be the largest in the camp, occupied by just one person, but that meant less than 2 spans by 2, and it was crowded with cot and chair and stool, washstand and stand mirror, and no fewer than 3 chests full of clothes. Chesa had seen to those last, and Shiriam and Ramonda and Lelaine and a dozen more sitters. They kept seeing to them. A few more gifts of silk shifts or stockings, 1 more dress grand enough to receive a king, and there would be need for a 4th chest. Maybe Shiriam and the sitters hoped all the fine dresses would blind her to anything else, but Chesa just thought the Amerlin seat had to be clothed suitably for her station. Servants, it seemed, believed in following the correct rituals as much as the hall ever did. Shortly, Selene would be there. It was her turn to undress Egwene for bed, another ritual. Only between her head and her restless feet, she was not ready for bed yet. Leaving the lamps burning, she hurried out before Selene could arrive. Walking would clear her head, and maybe tire her enough that she could sleep soundly. Putting herself to sleep would be no problem. The Wise One Dreamwalkers had taught herself that skill early on. Yet finding any rest in it was another matter. Especially when her mind boiled with a list of worries that began with Ramonda and Lelaine and Shiriam, then ran through Rand, Elida, Gideon, Weather, and on out of sight. She avoided the area near Gideon's tent. If she asked questions herself, too much importance would be given to a servant running away. Discretion had become part of her. The game she played allowed few slips, and being careless where you knew it did not matter could lead to be careless where it did. Worse, you could discover you had been wrong about where it mattered. The weak must be bold cautiously. That was Swan again. She truly did her best to teach, and she knew this particular game very well. There were no more people out and about in the moon-shadowed camp than there had been before. Handfuls slouched wearily around low fires, exhausted
Nick,
by their
how you doing?
evening labors after a hard day's journey. Those who saw her rose
just
tiredly to
chilling
make their
and listening
courtesies
to,
as she passed,
to your
murmuring,
audiobook,
"The light
Nick."
shine on you, Mother," or something like, occasionally asking her blessing, which she gave with a simple, "The light bless you, my child." Men and women old enough to be her grandparents
That's
sat
pretty much
back
all
down
it is,
beaming
bro.
from that. Yet she wondered what they actually believed about her, what they knew. All the Aes Sedai
welcome.
presented an unbroken front to the outside world, including their own servants. But Swan said that if you believed a servant knew twice what he should, you only knew half the truth. Still, those bows and curtsies and murmurs followed her from one clump of people to the next, comforting her with the possibility that there were some at least who did not see her as a child the hall brought out when they needed her. As she passed an open area surrounded by ropes tied to posts driven into the ground, a gateway's silver slash of light flashed vivid in the darkness as it rotated open.
It's what I usually
It
do
was
at
not
night
really
is
light, though. It cast
I'll play
no
an
shadows.
audiobook
She paused to watch
start to
beside a corner
finish.
post. No one at the nearby fires even looked
like
up.
how it's going
They were
today.
used to this by now.
When I end my
A
live,
dozen or
I'll
more
pause
sisters,
the book,
twice as many servants, and a
and then when
number
I
of
start up
rovers
again the
bustled
next
out,
day,
returning with
I
messages
pick up
and
from where we
wicked
left
cages of
off.
pigeons from the dovecotes in Salidar, a good
Figured it'd be
500
something
miles
that
west and south
at
as
least
the
some
goose
people
flew.
would enjoy and
They began scattering
find
before the gateway
relaxing.
closed, carrying their burdens to sitters, to their ajas, a few back to their own tents.
I know it's not for
Most
everyone,
nights
but
Swan would have been with
hey,
them.
some people
She seldom
enjoy
trusted
it.
anyone else to fetch messages destined for her, even if most were in codes or ciphers. Sometimes the world seemed to hold more networks of eyes and ears than it did Aes Sedai, though most were severely truncated by circumstance. The majority of agents for the various Ajas seemed to be lying low until the difficulties in the White Tower subsided, and a good many of the individual sisters' eyes and ears had no idea where the woman they served was at present. Several of the warders saw Egwene and made careful bows, with a respect proper to the stole. Sisters might eye her askance, but the hall had raised her Amelin and the Gaidin needed no more. A number of the servants offered bows or curtsies too. Not one of the Aes Sedai hurrying away from the gateway so much as glanced in her direction.
I've been playing this game for
perhaps they did not notice
several years.
Perhaps.
In
a way, that anybody could still hear from any of their eyes and ears at all was one of Mogedian's gifts. The sisters with the strength to make gateways had all been in Salidar long enough to know it well. Those who could weave a gateway of useful size were able to travel almost anywhere from there and land right on the spot. Trying to travel to Salidar, however, would have meant spending half of each night learning the new roped-off patch of ground, more for some, every time they made camp. What Egwene had pried from Mogedian was a way to journey from a place you did not know well to one you did. Slower than traveling, skimming was not one of the lost science. No one had ever heard of it, so even the name was credited to Egwene. Anyone who could travel could skim, so every night sisters skimmed to Salidar, checking the dovecotes for birds that had returned to where they had been hatched, then traveled back. The sight should have pleased her. The rebel Aes Sedai had gained talents the White Tower thought lost forever, as well as learned new ones. And those abilities would help cost Elida the Amerlin seat before all was done. Yet instead of pleasure, Egwene felt sourness. Being snubbed had nothing to do with it, or not much anyway. As she walked on, the fires grew farther between, then faded behind. All around her lay the dark shapes of wagons, most with canvas tops stretched over iron hoops, and tents glowing palely in the moonlight. Beyond, the army's campfires climbed the surrounding hills all around, the stars brought to ground. The silence from Caemlyn tied her middle into knots, whatever anyone else thought. The very day they left Salidar, a message had arrived, though Shiriam had not bothered to show it to her until a few days ago, and then with repeated warnings on the need to keep the contents secret. The Hall knew, but no one else must. More of the 10,000 secrets that infested the camp. Egwene was sure she'd never would have seen it if she had not kept going on about Rand. She could recall every carefully chosen word, written in a tiny hand on paper so thin it was a wonder the pen had not torn through. We are well settled at the inn of which we spoke, and we have met with the wool merchant. He is a very remarkable young man, everything that Nynaeve told us. Still, he was courteous. I think he is somewhat afraid of us, which is to the good. It will go well. You may have heard rumors about men here, including a fellow from Saldaea. The rumors are all too true, I fear, but we have seen none of them and will avoid them if we can. If you pursue 2 hares, both will escape you. Varen and Alana are here, with a number of young women from the same region as the wool merchant. I will try to send them on to you for training. Alana has formed an attachment to the wool merchant, which may prove useful, though it is troubling, too. All will go well, I am sure. Shiriam emphasized the good news as she saw it. Mirana, an experienced negotiator, had reached Caemlyn and been well received by Rand, the wool merchant. Wonderful news to Shiriam. And Varen and Alana would be bringing 2 Rivers girls to become novices. Shiriam was sure they must be coming down the same road they themselves were heading. She seemed to think Egwene would be all aglow at the expectation of seeing faces from home. Mirana would handle everything. Mirana knew what she was doing. That's a bucket of horse sweat, Egwene muttered at the night. A gap-toothed fellow carrying a large wooden bucket gave a start and gaped at her, so amazed he forgot to bow. Rand? Courteous? She had seen his first meeting with Coiron Saldane, Elida's emissary. Overbearing summed it up nicely. Why should he be different with Marana? And Marana thought he was afraid, thought that was good. Rand was seldom afraid even when he should be, and if he was now, Marana should remember that fear could make the mildest man dangerous. Remember that Rand was dangerous just being who he was. And what was this attachment Alana had formed? Egwene did not entirely trust Alana. The woman did extremely odd things at times, maybe impetuously and maybe with some deeper motive. Egwene would not put it past her to find a way into Rand's bed. It would be clay in the hands of a woman like her. Elaine would break Alana's neck if that was so, but that was the least of it. Worst of all, no more of the pigeons Marana had taken with her had appeared in the Salidar dovecotes. Marana should have had some word to send, if only that she and the rest of the embassy had gone to Cairhien. Lately, the Wise Ones did little more than acknowledge Rand was alive, yet it seemed he was there, sitting on his hands as far as she could make out, which should have been a warning beacon. Shiriam saw it differently. Who could say why any man did what he did? Probably not even the man himself most of the time, and when it came to one who could channel. Silence proved all was well. Marana surely would have reported any real difficulty. She must be on her way to Cairhien, if not there already, and there was no need to report further until she could send word of success. For that matter, Rand in Cairhien was success of a sort. One of Marana's goals, if not the most important, had been to ease him out of Caemlyn so that Elaine could return there safely and take the Lion Throne, and the dangers of Cairhien had dissipated. Incredible as it seemed, the Wise Ones said Coiron and her embassy had left the city on their way back to Tar Valon. Or maybe not so incredible. It all made a sort of sense, given Rand, given the way Aes Sedai did things. Even so, to Egwene, it all felt wrong. I have to go to him, she muttered. 1 hour and she could straighten everything out. Underneath, he was still Rand. That's all there is to it. I have to go to him. That isn't possible, and you know it. If Egwene had not had herself on a tight rein, she would have jumped a foot. As it was, her heart pounded even after she made out Lyanna by the light of the moon. I thought you were, she said, before she could stop herself, and only just managed not to say Moghedien's name. The taller woman fell in beside her, keeping a careful watch for other sisters as they walked. Lyanna did not have Swan's excuse for spending time with her. Not that being seen together once should cause any harm, but should not isn't always will not, Egwene reminded herself. Slipping the stole from her shoulders, she folded it to carry in one hand. At a glance from a distance, Lyanna might well be taken for an accepted, despite her dress. Many accepted lacked enough of the banded white dresses to wear one all the time. From a distance, Egwene might be taken for one too. Not the most pacifying thought. Theodrin and Fairlane are asking around near Marigan's tent, Mother. They weren't especially pleased. I did a fine sulk over carrying messages, if I do say so. Theodrin had to stop Fairlane dressing me down for it. Lyanna's laughter was quiet and breathy. Situations that grated Swan's usually amused her. She was cosseted by most of the other sisters for how well she had adjusted. Good, good, Egwene said absently. Marana misstepped somehow, Lyanna, or he wouldn't be staying in Cairhien and she wouldn't be taken. Off in the distance, a dog bayed at the moon, then others, until they were abruptly silenced by shouts that perhaps luckily she could not quite understand. A number of the soldiers had dogs tagging along. There were none in the Aes Sedai camp. Any number of cats, but no dogs. Marana does know what she's doing, Mother. It sounded very like a sigh. Lyanna and Swan both agreed with Shiriam. Everyone did, except her. When you give someone a task, you have to trust it to them. Egwene sniffed and folded her arms. Lyanna, that man could strike sparks from a damp cloth if it wore the shawl. I don't know Marana, but I've never seen an Aes Sedai who qualified as a damp cloth. I've met one or two, Lyanna chuckled. This time her sigh was plain. But not Marana, true. Does he really believe he has friends inside the tower? Alviarin? That might make him difficult for Marana, I suppose. But I can hardly see Alviarin doing anything to risk her place. She was always ambitious enough for 3. He says he has a letter from her. She could still see Rand gloating over receiving letters from Elijah and Elziarin both, just before she herself left Kyrian. Maybe her ambitions make her think she can replace Elida with him on her side. That's if she really wrote it, if it exists. He thinks he's clever, Lyanna. Maybe he is, but he doesn't believe he needs anyone. Rand would go on thinking he could handle anything by himself right up until one of those anythings crushed him. I know him inside and out, Lyanna. Being around the Wise Ones seems to have infected him, or maybe he infected them. Whatever the sitters think, whatever any of you think, an Aes Sedai's shawl doesn't impress him any more than it does the Wise Ones. Sooner or later he'll exasperate a sister until she does something about it, or one of them will push him the wrong way, not realizing how strong he is and what his temper is now. After that, there might be no going back. I'm the only one who can deal with him safely. The only one. He can hardly be as irritating as those Aiel women, Lyanna murmured wryly. Even she found it difficult to be amused by her experiences with the Wise Ones. But it hardly matters. The Amerlin seat being valued with the White Tower itself. A pair of women appeared between the tents ahead, moving slowly as they talked. Distance and shadow obscured their faces, yet it was clear they were Aes Sedai from the way they carried themselves, an assurance that nothing hiding in any darkness could harm them. No accepted on the brink of the shawl could manage quite that degree of confidence. A queen with an army at her back might not.
Little
They were coming toward her and
dab in
Lyanna.
there.
Lyanna quickly turned in to the deeper dimness between 2 wagons. Scowling with frustration, Egwene nearly pulled her out again and marched on. Let it all come into the open. She would stand before the hall and tell them it was time they realized the Amerlin's stole was more than a pretty scarf. She would... Following Lyanna, she motioned the other woman to walk on. What she would not do was throw everything on the midden heap in a fit of pique. Only one tower law specifically limited the power of the Amerlin seat. A fistful of irritating customs and a barrel full of inconvenient realities, but only one law. Yet it could not have been a worse for her purposes. The Amerlin seat being valued with the White Tower itself as the very heart of the White Tower, she must not be endangered without dire necessity. Therefore, unless the White Tower be at war by declaration of the Hall of the Tower, the Amerlin seat shall seek the lesser consensus of the Hall of the Tower before deliberately placing herself in the way of any danger, and she shall abide by the consensus that stands. What rash incident by an Amerlin had inspired that,
Hair keeps
Egwene
getting
did
in my
not
face
know,
and making
but
me
it had been
make
law
my
for
face
something
itch.
over 2,000 years. To most Aes Sedai, any law that old attained an aura of holiness. Changing it was unthinkable. Romonda had quoted that bloody law as though lecturing a half-wit. If the daughter heir of Andor could not be allowed within 100 miles of the Dragon Reborn, how much more they must preserve the Amerlin seat. Lelaine sounded almost regretful, most likely because she was agreeing with Romonda. That had nearly curdled both their tongues. Without them, both of them, the lesser consensus lay as far out of reach as the light. Even that declaration of war only required the lesser consensus. So if she could not obtain permission... Lyanna cleared her throat. You can hardly do much if you go in secret, Mother, and the Hall will find out, soon or late. I think you would find it difficult to have an hour to yourself after that. Not that they dare put a guard on you precisely, but there are ways. I can quote examples from certain sources. She never mentioned the hidden records directly unless they were behind a ward. Am I so transparent? Egwene asked after a moment. There were only wagons around them here, and beneath the wagons the dark mounds of sleeping wagon drivers and horse handlers and all the rest needed to keep so many vehicles moving. It was remarkable just how many conveyances over 300 Aes Sedai required, when few would condescend to ride even a mile in wagon or cart. But there were tents and furnishings and foodstuffs, and 1,000 things needed to keep the sisters and those who served them. The loudest sounds here were snores, a chorus of frogs. No, Mother, Lyanna laughed softly. I just thought what I would do. But it's well known I've lost all my dignity and sense. The Amerlin seat can hardly take me for a model. I think you must let young Master Althor go as he will, for a time anyway, while you pluck the goose that's in front of you.
Better.
His way may lead us all to the pit of doom, Egwene muttered, but it was not an argument. There had to be a way to pluck that goose and still keep Rand from making dangerous mistakes, but she could not see it now. Not frogs. Those snores sounded like 100 saws cutting logs full of knots. This is as bad a spot for a soothing walk as I've ever visited. I think I might as well go to bed. Lyanna tilted her head. In that case, Mother, if you will forgive me, there's a man in Lord Bryn's camp. After all, who ever heard of a green without even one warder? From the sudden quickening in her voice, you might have thought she was off to meet a lover. Considering what Egwene had heard about greens, perhaps there was not that much difference. Back among the tents, the last of the fires had been doused with dirt. No one took risks with fire when the countryside was tinder dry. A few tendrils of smoke rose lazily in the moonlight where the job had not been well done. A man murmured drowsily in his sleep inside a tent, and here and there a cough drifted out or a rasping snore, but otherwise the camp lay silent and still. Which was why Egwene was surprised when someone stepped from the shadows in front of her, especially someone wearing the simple white dress of a novice. Mother, I need to speak to you. Nicola? Egwene had made a point of fixing name to face for every novice, no easy chore given how sisters hunted all along the army's path for girls and young women who could learn. Active search was still not well thought of. Custom was to wait for the girl to ask, best of all to wait for her to come to the tower, but 10 times as many novices studied in the camp now as the White Tower had held in years. Nicola was one to be remembered, though, and besides, Egwene had often noticed the young woman staring at her. Tiana won't be pleased if she finds you up this late. Tiana Nozella was the mistress of novices, known equally for a comforting shoulder when a novice needed to cry, and an unyielding stance when it came to rules. The other woman shifted as if to hurry away, then straightened her back. Sweat glistened on her cheeks. The darkness was cooler than the light had been, but not what anyone would call cool, and the simple trick of ignoring heat or cold came only with the shawl. I know I'm supposed to ask to see Tiana Sedai and then ask her to see you, Mother, but she'd never let a novice approach the Amerlin seat. About what, child? Egwene asked. The woman was older by 6 or 7 years at least, but that was the proper address for a novice. Fidgeting with her skirt, Nicola stepped closer. Large eyes met Egwene's, perhaps more directly than a novice's should have. Mother, I want to go as far as I can. Her hands plucked at her dress, but her voice was cool and self-possessed, fit for an Aes Sedai. I won't say they are holding me back, but I am sure I can become stronger than they say. I just know I can. You were never held back, Mother. No one has ever gained so much of her strength as fast as you. All I ask is the same chance. Movement in the shadow behind Nicola turned into another sweaty-faced woman, this one in short coat and wide trousers, carrying a bow. Her hair hung to her waist in a braid tied with 6 ribbons, and she wore short boots with raised heels. Nicola Treehill and Arena Nurmasiv seemed an odd pair to be friends. Like many of the older novices, women with nearly 10 years on Egwene were tested now, though many sisters still grumbled that they were 10 years too old to accept novice discipline. Like many of those older women, Nicola was ferocious in her desire to learn, by all reports, and she had a potential bettered only by Nynaeve, Elaine, and Egwene herself among living Aes Sedai. In fact, Nicola apparently was making great strides, often great enough that her teachers had to slow her down. Some said she had begun picking up weaves as if she already knew them. Not only that, but she already demonstrated 2 talents, although the ability to see Taviran was minor, while the major talent, foretelling, emerged so that no one understood what she had foretold. She herself did not remember a word she said. All in all, Nicola was already marked by the sisters as someone to watch despite her late start. The begrudging agreement to test women older than 17 or 18 probably could be laid at Nicola's feet. Arena, on the other hand, was a hunter for the horn who swaggered as much as a man and sat around talking of adventures, those she had had and those she would, when she was not practicing with her bow. Very likely she had picked that weapon up from Brigitte, along with her manner of dress. She certainly seemed to have no interest in anything beside the bow, except flirting occasionally in a rather forward manner, though not lately. Perhaps long days on the road left her too tired for it, if not for archery. Why she was still traveling with them, Egwene could not understand. It was hardly likely that Arena believed the Horn of Valir would turn up along their march, and impossible that she even suspected it was hidden away inside the White Tower. Very few people knew that. Egwene was not certain even Elida did. Arena seemed a posturing fool, but Egwene felt a certain sympathy for Nicola. She understood the woman's discontent, understood wanting to know it all now. She had been that way too. Maybe she still was. "Nicola," she said gently, "we all have limits. I'll never match Nynaeve Sedai, for example, whatever I do. But if I could only have the chance, Mother." Nicola actually wrung her hands in pleading, and there was a touch of it in her voice, yet her eyes still met Egwene's levelly. "The chance you had. What I did, because I had no choice, because I didn't know better, is called forcing, Nicola, and it is dangerous." She had not heard that term until Swan apologized for doing it to her. That was one time Swan truly had seemed repentant. "You know if you try to channel more of Saidar than you're ready to handle, you risk burning yourself out before you ever come close to your full strength. Best you learn to be patient. The sisters won't let you be anything else until you are ready anyway." "We came to Salidar on the same riverboat as Nynaeve and Elaine," Arena said suddenly. Her gaze was more than direct. It was challenging. "And Brigitte." For some reason, she said the name bitterly. Nicola made shushing motions. There's no need to bring that up. Oddly, she did not sound as if she meant it. Hoping she was keeping her face half so smooth as Nicola's, Egwene tried to quell a sudden uneasiness. Marigan had come to Salidar on that boat, too. An owl hooted, and she shivered. Some people thought hearing an owl in moonlight meant bad news was coming. She was not superstitious, but no need to bring up what? The other two women exchanged looks, and Arena nodded. It was on the walk from the river to the village. For all her supposed reluctance, Nicola peered straight into Egwene's eyes. "Arena and I heard Tom Marilyn and Jewelin Sandar talking. The Gleeman and the thief-taker. Jewelin said if there were Aes Sedai in the village, we weren't sure yet, and they learned Nynaeve and Elaine had been pretending to be Aes Sedai, then we were all jumping into a school of Silverpike, which I take it isn't very safe." "The Gleeman saw us and hushed him," Arena put in, fingering the quiver at her waist. "But we heard." Her voice was hard as her stare. "I know they're both Aes Sedai now, Mother, but wouldn't they still be in trouble if anyone found out? The sisters, I mean? Anyone who pretends to be a sister is in trouble if they find out, even years later." Nicola's face did not change, but her gaze suddenly seemed to be trying to fix Egwene's. She leaned a little forward, intent. "Anybody at all? Isn't that so?" Emboldened by Egwene's silence, Arena grinned, an unpleasant grin in the night. "I hear Nynaeve and Elaine were sent out of the tower on some task by the Sanche woman back when she was Amerlin. I hear you were sent off by her too at the same time. Got into all sorts of trouble when you came back." Sly insinuation slithered into her voice. "Do you remember them playing at Aes Sedai?" They stood there looking at her, Arena leaning insolently on her bow, Nicola so expectant the air should have crackled. "Swan Sanche is Aes Sedai," Egwene said coldly, "and so are Nynaeve Almira and Elaine Trakand. You will show them proper respect. To you they are Swan Sedai, Nynaeve Sedai, and Elaine Sedai." The pair blinked in surprise. Inside, her stomach quivered with outrage. After everything she had been through tonight, she was confronted with blackmail from these... She think of a word bad enough. Elaine could have. Elaine listened to stablemen and wagon drivers and every sort, memorizing the words she should have refused to hear. Unfolding the striped stole, Egwene draped it carefully across her shoulders. "I don't think you understand, Mother," Nicola said hastily. Not fearfully, however, just attempting to force her point. "I merely worried that if anyone found out that you had—" Egwene gave her no chance to go further. "Oh, I understand, child." The fool woman was a child, however old she was. Any number of the older novices gave trouble, usually in the form of insolence toward accepted, set to teach them, but even the silliest had sense enough to avoid impertinence to the sisters. It fanned her anger to white heat that the woman had the gall to try this on with her. They were both taller than she, if not by much, but she planted her fists on her hips and drew herself up, and they shrank away as though she loomed. "Do you have any notion how serious ranges against a sister, especially for a novice? Charges based on a conversation you claim to have heard between men now 1,000 miles away? Tiana would skin you alive and put you to scrubbing pots the rest of your natural life." Nicola kept trying to push a word in. Apologies, they sounded like this time, and more protests that Egwene did not understand. Frantic attempts to change everything. But Egwene ignored her and rounded on Arena. The hunter took another step back, wetting her lips and looking remarkably uncertain. "You needn't think you would walk away clear either. Even a hunter could be hauled to Tiana for a thing like this. If you're lucky enough not to be flogged at a wagon tongue, the way they do soldiers caught stealing. Either way, you'll be tossed out by the road with your welts for company." Drawing a deep breath, Egwene folded her hands at her waist. Clutched together, they would not tremble. All but cowering, the pair looked suitably chastened. She hoped those downcast eyes and slumped shoulders and shifting feet were not feigned. By rights, she should send them to Tiana right now. She had no idea what the penalty might be for trying to blackmail the Amerlin seat, but it seemed likely that being turned out of the camp would be the least of it. In Nicola's case, the turning out would have to wait until her teachers were satisfied she knew enough of channeling not to hurt herself or others by accident. Nicola Treehill would never be Aes Sedai, though, once that charge was laid against her. All that potential would go for nothing. Except any woman caught pretending to be Aes Sedai was set down so hard she would still be whimpering years later. And an accepted caught might very well consider the other woman fortunate. But surely Nynaeve and Elaine were safe, now they really were sisters. Herself as well. Only, it might take no more than a whisper of this to erase any chance of making the Hall acknowledge her truly the Amerlin seat. As well jaunt off to Rand, and then tell the Hall to their faces. She dared not allow these two to see her doubt, or even suspect. "I will forget this," she said sharply. "But if I hear so much as a whisper of it again from anyone—" She drew a ragged breath. If she heard shouts of it, there might be little she could do. But by the way they jumped, they read a threat that pricked deep. "Get to your beds before I change my mind." In an instant, they became a flurry of curtsies, of "Yes, Mother," and "No, Mother," and "As you command, Mother." They scurried away, looking back over their shoulders at her, every step faster than the last, until they were running. She had to walk on sedately, but she wanted to run too. Chapter 10. Unseen Eyes. Selene was waiting when Egwene got back to her tent, a rail-thin woman with dark Tyran coloring and a nearly impervious self-assurance. Chaser was right. She did carry her long nose raised, as though recoiling from a bad smell. Yet, if her manner with the other maids was arrogant, she was in reality quite different around her patroness. As Egwene entered, Selene folded herself into a curtsy so deep her head nearly brushed the carpet, skirts spread as wide as they would go in the cramped quarters. Before Egwene had taken her second step inside, the woman leaped up, fussing over her buttons, and fussing over her, too. Selene had very little sense. "Oh, Mother, you went out with your head uncovered again." As if she had ever worn any of those beaded caps the woman favored, or the embroidered velvet things Mary favored, or Chase's plumed hats. "Why, you're shivering. You should never go walking out of doors without a shawl and parasol, Mother." How was a parasol supposed to stop shivering? With sweat trickling down her own cheeks, however fast she dabbed with her handkerchief, Selene never thought to ask why she shivered, which was perhaps just as well. And you went alone in the night. It just isn't proper, Mother. Besides, there are all those soldiers, rough men, with no decent respect for any woman, even Aes Sedai. Mother, you simply mustn't. Egwene let the foolish words wash over her in the same way she let the woman undress her, paying less than half a mind. Ordering her to be quiet would only produce so many hurt looks and abused sighs that it made little difference. Except for the brainless chatter, Selene performed her duties diligently, if with so many flourishes they became a dance of grand gestures and obsequious curtsies. It seemed impossible that anyone could be as silly as Selene, always concerned with appearances, always worrying over what people would think. To her, people were Aes Sedai and the nobility, and their upper servants. By her book, no one else mattered. Perhaps no one else thought by her book. It probably was impossible. Egwene was not about to forget who had found Selene in the first place, any more than she did who had found Mary. True, Chesa was a gift from Shiriam, but Chesa had shown her loyalties to Egwene more than once. Egwene wanted to tell herself the tremors that the other woman took for shivers were quivers of rage, yet she knew a worm of fear writhed in her belly. She had come too far, had too much to do yet, to allow Nicola and Arena to put a spoke through her wheels. As her head popped through the top of a clean shift, she caught a bit of the skinny woman's prattle and stared. Did you say ewe's milk? Oh, yes, Mother. Your skin is so soft, and nothing will keep it that way like bathing in ewe's milk. Maybe she really was an idiot. Hustling a protesting Selene out, Egwene brushed her own hair, turned down her own cot, placed the now useless Idom bracelet in the small carved ivory box where she kept her few pieces of jewelry, then extinguished the lamps. All by myself, she thought sarcastically in the darkness. Selene and Mary will have conniptions. Before retiring, however, she padded to the entrance and opened a small gap in the door flaps. Outside was moonlit stillness and silence, broken by a night heron's cry that suddenly cut off in a shriek. There were hunters abroad in the darkness. After a moment, something moved in the shadows beside a tent across the way. It looked like a woman. Perhaps idiocy did not disqualify Selene any more than dour-faced gloom eliminated Mary. It could be either one, or someone else entirely. Even Nicola or Arena, however unlikely. She let the tent flap fall shut with a smile. Whoever the watcher was would not see where she went tonight. The way the wise ones had taught her to put herself to sleep was simple. Eyes closed, feeling each part of the body relax in turn, breathing in time with her heartbeat, mind unfocused and drifting, all but one tiny corner, drifting. Sleep swept over her in moments, but it was the sleep of a dream walker. Formless, she floated deep within an ocean of stars, infinite points of light glimmering in an infinite sea of darkness, fireflies beyond counting flickering in an endless night. Those were dreams, the dreams of everyone sleeping anywhere in the world, maybe of everyone in all possible worlds, and this was the gap between reality and Tel'aran'rhiod, Riod, the space separating the waking world from the world of dreams. Wherever she looked, 10,000 fireflies vanished as people woke, and 10,000 new were born to replace them. A vast, ever-changing array of sparkling beauty. She did not waste time in admiration, though. This place held dangers, some deadly. She was sure she knew how to avoid those, but one peril in this place aimed straight at her if she lingered too long, and being caught in it would be embarrassing, to say the least. Keeping a wary eye out, well, it would have been a wary eye had she had eyes here, she moved. She had no sense of motion. It seemed she stood still, and that glittering ocean swirled around her until one light settled before her. Every twinkling star looked exactly like every other, yet she knew this was Nynaeve's dream. How she knew was another matter. Not even the wise ones understood that recognition. She had considered trying to find Nicola's dreams and Arena's. Once she unearthed them, she knew exactly how to sink the fear of the light into their bones, and she did not give a fig that every bit of it was prescribed. Practicality sent her here instead, not fear of the forbidden. She had done what was not done before, and she was certain she would again should it become necessary. Do what you must, then pay the price for it, was what she had been taught by the same women who had marked off those forbidden areas. It was refusal to admit the debt, refusal to pay, that often turned necessity to evil. But even if that pair were asleep, locating someone's dreams the first time was arduous at best, without guarantees. Days of efforts, nights of it rather, were more likely to deliver nothing. This was at least sure. Slowly she moved closer through
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support.